Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Horror Halloween. Now I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. There's a small forest near where I grew up. People in our town used to call it Whispering Pines. It was the kind of forest that looked peaceful during the day, with birds chirping and squirrels racing up the trees. But at night, it was something else entirely. The place was dark and deep, with a chilling silence that made even the bravest folks uneasy. Over the years, a handful of people went missing in those woods. Most of them were hikers or campers, folks who thought they could handle a night alone in the wilderness. They'd set up camp, build a fire, and vanish by morning, leaving nothing behind but an empty tent and cold ashes. I remember my friend Jack, who swore he'd never be scared of the forest. Jack was one of those fearless types, always looking for an adventure, and he'd laugh off the stories like they were just campfire tales. One night, Jack dared me and a couple of friends to go camping in Whispering Pines. We were all skeptical, of course, but we didn't want to look scared in front of Jack. We gathered up our sleeping bags, flashlights, and some food. We didn't tell our parents where we were going. We figured we'd be back by morning, and no one would even notice. By sunset, we were deep in the forest, trying to find a good spot to camp. The deeper we went, the thicker the trees got, and the sunlight faded quicker than I expected. Shadows grew longer, stretching across the ground like dark fingers reaching for us. Finally, we set up camp and sat around a small fire. Jack was telling some joke when we heard it, a soft, barely there whisper. It sounded like a woman's voice, far off in the distance. We all froze, listening. The voice came again, but closer this time. It was like someone was calling for help, but we couldn't make out the words. Jack laughed it off, saying it was just the wind. But the rest of us weren't so sure. The sound grew louder, more urgent, as if it was coming from all around us. I tried shining my flashlight into the trees, but all I saw was darkness. Then, Jack did something that I still can't believe. He decided he was going to find out what it was. He grabbed his flashlight and started walking toward the trees. We all shouted at him to stop, but he just waved us off, saying we were being ridiculous. He disappeared into the shadows, and after a minute, the sound of his footsteps faded. We were left in complete silence, the only sound being the crackling of the fire. We waited and waited, calling out Jack's name, but there was no answer. Hours passed, and by then, we were scared out of our minds. One of us wanted to go look for him, but the rest of us thought it was better to stay put. We kept thinking he'd come back any minute, laughing and calling us cowards. But Jack never came back. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, we packed up and ran back to town, straight to the police station. The search for Jack lasted for days. They combed through every inch of that forest, but there was no sign of him. No tracks, no clothes, nothing. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. A few months after Jack disappeared, strange things started happening in town. People would find weird symbols carved into the trees near the edge of the forest. Some folks claimed they saw shadowy figures moving between the trees at dusk. And there was this strange, low humming sound that you could hear if you stood near the forest, like some kind of eerie, otherworldly song. Eventually, people stopped going into Whispering Pines altogether. It became this sort of forbidden place that everyone in town avoided, a place marked by fear and loss. The story of Jack's disappearance was passed down, a warning to anyone who thought about going too deep into the woods. Sometimes I wonder what happened to Jack out there. Did he get lost? Did he see something he shouldn't have? Or was it something else entirely, something that can't be explained? I've heard other stories, too, from towns nearby. Stories about people disappearing in forests, just like Whispering Pines, people who were never seen again. It makes you wonder if there's something lurking out there in the woods, something that doesn't want to be found. And maybe that's why it's better to stay away from places like Whispering Pines, to leave the mysteries of the forest alone. Because some things, once you go looking for them, don't let you come back. The first time I heard about Blackwood was from my grandpa. He used to tell me stories about the forest when I was a kid, stories that he swore were true. He'd always start the same way. The Blackwood doesn't like visitors. He told me about a time when he was a young man, not much older than me now, and how he and his best friend went camping there one weekend. They had heard the stories, of course, but like most young people, they didn't believe them. They thought they'd just go, spend the night, and laugh about it later. But they barely made it through the night. According to my grandpa, he and his friend Sam set up camp deep in the Blackwood, far from the main path. As they were setting up their tent, they noticed how quiet it was. No birds, no animals, just complete silence. It was unsettling, but they shrugged it off, thinking maybe the animals were just shy. They built a fire and started cooking, but it wasn't long before they heard something strange. It was a soft humming sound, like someone singing just out of earshot. They looked around, but there was no one else there. Then, the humming stopped, replaced by a rustling sound, like someone was walking through the trees, moving closer. "Did you hear that?" Sam had asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," my grandpa replied, his heart pounding in his chest. They tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just the wind or an animal moving through the forest. But deep down, they both felt something wasn't right. And that's when they saw her. Standing just beyond the edge of the firelight was a woman. She was pale, almost ghostly, and her clothes looked old, like something from a different time. She was staring at them with empty, hollow eyes, and her lips were moving, like she was whispering something they couldn't hear. My grandpa froze, unable to move or look away. Sam grabbed his arm, whispering, "Let's get out of here." But the woman stepped closer, her feet barely making a sound on the forest floor. She raised a hand, pointing at them, and her eyes seemed to grow darker, like two black holes swallowing the light. My grandpa and Sam ran, leaving their gear and their fire behind. They didn't stop until they were out of the forest, panting and out of breath. They never went back to Blackwood, and they never spoke about what they saw again. That story stayed with me, but as I got older, I started to think maybe my grandpa was just trying to scare me. Maybe he made it all up, or maybe he was just imagining things. But then, a few years later, something happened that changed everything. It was summer, and a group of high school kids decided to go camping in the Blackwood, just like my grandpa and Sam had. They'd heard the stories, of course, but they thought it would be fun, like some kind of challenge. There were 5 of them, 2 girls and 3 boys, and they were all excited about the adventure. They went into the forest in the late afternoon, laughing and joking as they hiked deeper into the trees. They took pictures, making fun of each other and daring one another to keep going. By nightfall, they had set up camp and were sitting around a fire, just like my grandpa and Sam had. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the laughter faded. The forest around them grew dark and silent, and a feeling of unease settled over them. They started hearing noises, footsteps, whispers, strange rustling sounds. But every time they looked, there was nothing there. Then, one of the boys, a guy named Mike, noticed something strange. Off in the distance, he could see a faint light moving through the trees. It was small and dim, like a lantern, and it was swaying back and forth, as if someone was walking toward them. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing. The others looked and nodded, but no one moved. They just sat there, staring at the light as it came closer and closer. And then they saw her, the same woman my grandpa had described all those years ago, pale, with empty eyes and old-fashioned clothes, moving silently through the trees. One of the girls, Emily, whispered, "We need to leave. Now." But as they stood up, the woman disappeared, and the light went out. They looked around, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. They started to laugh, thinking maybe it was just their imagination. But then they heard the humming. It was soft at first, almost too quiet to hear, but it grew louder and louder until it filled the air around them. The sound was coming from all directions, echoing through the trees. Panicking, they grabbed their stuff and ran, stumbling through the darkness, trying to find their way out. They kept running until they were out of breath, but somehow they ended up back at their campsite. Confused and scared, they tried again, picking a different direction, but every time, they found themselves right back where they started. The forest wouldn't let them leave. As the hours passed, one by one, they started to disappear. First was Mike, who wandered off on his own. saying he thought he heard someone calling his name. Then the others started to vanish, disappearing into the darkness as if swallowed by the forest itself. By morning, only Emily was left. She was found by a search party, curled up by the cold ashes of the fire, her eyes wide with fear. She couldn't remember how she got there or what happened to her friends. She only remembered the woman, the humming, and the feeling of being watched. The search went on for weeks, but they never found any trace of the others. It was as if they had simply vanished, taken by the forest. Emily moved away not long after, leaving behind the town and the haunted memories of Blackwood. To this day, no one knows what happened to those kids. Some people say they got lost. Others say they were taken by some kind of ghost or spirit. But I think it's more than that. I think the Blackwood doesn't just take people. It keeps them. It's as if the forest has a mind of its own, and once you step too far inside, it decides whether or not you get to leave. Every so often, someone new will hear the story and decide they're brave enough to go into the Blackwood. They'll set out with their friends, laughing and daring each other, thinking it's all just a game. But they don't come back, and the search parties always come back empty-handed. Now, whenever I walk near the edge of the forest, I swear I can hear it, a faint humming, like a lullaby drifting through the trees, calling me in. And sometimes, just for a moment, I think I see shadows moving among the trees, watching, waiting. They say the Blackwood never lets go of what it takes, that it holds onto its secrets and its shadows. So if you ever find yourself near those dark, twisted trees, remember this story. And whatever you do, don't follow the light. Because once the Blackwood takes you, there's no coming back. One fall afternoon, Tyler decided he'd explore a part of Shadow Falls that hadn't been marked on any map. It was deep, dark, and untouched, a place that even the locals avoided. But to Tyler, it was the perfect adventure. He packed a small bag with water, snacks, and a flashlight and headed out before sunset. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, figuring he'd be back before dark. But as the hours passed, night fell, and there was still no sign of Tyler. His family grew worried, and a search party was organized early the next morning. They combed through the trails, calling his name, but found no trace of him. It was as if he'd vanished without a trace. 3 days later, Tyler's best friend, Ethan, decided he couldn't sit around and wait any longer. He knew Tyler would have done the same if it were him. So, he grabbed a flashlight and a map, determined to find his friend. Ethan followed Tyler's usual route, looking for any signs that he'd been there. He checked every path, every fork, and still found nothing. Finally, he came to a part of the forest that was darker, denser, where the trees seemed to crowd together, blocking out the sunlight. It was here that he noticed something strange. There was a faint trail of broken branches and trampled leaves leading off the main path, deeper into the woods. He followed the trail, hoping it would lead him to Tyler. As he walked, the trees seemed to close in around him, their twisted branches casting eerie shadows across the ground. The air grew colder, and a thick mist began to settle, curling around his ankles like ghostly fingers. But Ethan pushed forward, determined not to turn back. After an hour or so, he noticed something on the ground, a small piece of fabric snagged on a branch. It was part of Tyler's jacket. Relief washed over Ethan, and he hurried on, following the trail of broken branches and disturbed leaves. But the deeper he went, the stranger things became. The trees around him seemed to change, growing taller, their bark darker and rougher. The mist thickened, and strange sounds began to fill the air, distant whispers, faint rustling, and the occasional snap of a branch. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but the sounds grew louder, closer, until they seemed to be coming from all around him. Suddenly, Ethan heard it, a faint voice calling his name. It was soft, barely audible, but it was definitely Tyler's voice. Ethan's heart leapt with hope. He called out, "Tyler, is that you?" The voice came again, closer this time, whispering his name in a low, hoarse tone. Ethan followed the sound, weaving through the trees, his flashlight cutting through the mist. But as he got closer, he began to notice something strange. The voice didn't sound quite right. It was too slow, too stretched out, almost like someone was trying to mimic Tyler's voice. He stopped, a cold feeling spreading through his chest. The voice called his name again, but this time, it sounded different, almost mocking, like it was laughing at him. Ethan's hand tightened around his flashlight, and he took a step back, his heart pounding. "Tyler, if that's you, say something else," he called, his voice shaking. But instead of an answer, the voice just laughed, a chilling, hollow sound that echoed through the trees. Ethan turned and began to walk away, his pace quickening with every step. But no matter how far he walked, the trees seemed to stretch on endlessly, like they were trapping him, leading him deeper into the forest. Then he saw it, a small clearing up ahead, with a strange, twisted tree in the center. Its branches were bare and blackened, as if they'd been burned. And there, at the base of the tree, was Tyler. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He rushed forward, calling Tyler's name, but as he got closer, he stopped dead in his tracks. Tyler was sitting with his back against the tree, his head tilted to the side, his eyes wide open, but there was something wrong. Tyler's skin was pale and cold, his face frozen in an expression of terror. His mouth was open, as if he'd been screaming, and his hands were clutching at the ground, his fingers digging into the dirt. But the strangest part was his eyes. They were empty, hollow, like he'd seen something so terrifying that it had drained the life right out of him. Ethan felt a wave of nausea wash over him, but he forced himself to look away, his mind racing. He had to get out of there, had to find his way back. But as he turned to leave, he heard the voice again, calling his name in that same slow, mocking tone. He froze, his heart pounding. The voice was close, so close that it felt like it was right behind him. Slowly, he turned, his flashlight shaking in his hand. But there was nothing there, just the empty forest, shrouded in mist. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something move, a dark figure, slipping between the trees. It was tall and thin, its limbs twisted and unnatural, like it didn't quite belong in this world. The figure moved closer, its dark, hollow eyes fixed on him, and Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He turned and ran, his flashlight bobbing wildly as he sprinted through the trees. He didn't stop, didn't look back. His only thought was to get as far away as possible. But no matter how fast he ran, the forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees looming closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The whispers grew louder, filling the air around him, and he could feel the figure closing in, its cold, dark presence pressing down on him. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he kept running, desperate to escape. Finally, after what felt like hours, he stumbled out of the forest, collapsing onto the ground, gasping for breath. When he looked back, the mist had lifted, and the trees stood silent and still, as if nothing had happened. The search for Tyler continued for weeks, but no one ever found him. Ethan told the authorities what he'd seen, but they didn't believe him, saying it was just the result of stress and exhaustion. But Ethan knew what he'd seen, and he never went back to Shadow Falls again. In the years that followed, a few more people went missing in Shadow Falls, their disappearances just as mysterious as Tyler's. Some say the forest is cursed, that it traps those who wander too far inside, stealing their souls and leaving their empty bodies behind. Others say there's something darker, something ancient that lives in the heart of the forest, waiting for those who are foolish enough to enter. And even now, if you go near the edge of Shadow Falls at night, you might hear it, the faint sound of laughter, echoing through the trees, calling your name in a slow, mocking whisper. And if you're not careful, if you step too far into the darkness, you might never find your way back. Because once the forest takes you, it never lets go. One day, Rachel decided to go to Ravenswood alone, hoping to capture its haunting beauty through her lens. Her parents warned her not to go, and even her friends tried to talk her out of it. But Rachel was stubborn. She promised she'd be careful and that she'd be back before dark. She arrived at Ravenswood in the early afternoon, parking her car at the edge of the forest. She took her camera, a flashlight, and her phone, just in case. She had a map, but it was old and barely legible, with faded paths that didn't seem to match up with what she saw in front of her. Still, she shrugged it off and set out, eager to get some good shots before the light faded. As she walked, she noticed how quiet the forest was. There were no birds singing, no leaves rustling, just a heavy, almost oppressive silence that made her feel like she was being watched. She tried to shake off the feeling, focusing instead on the patterns of light and shadow that danced across the forest floor. The deeper she went, the darker and colder it became, even though it was still early in the day. Rachel spent hours wandering, snapping pictures of twisted trees and strange, moss-covered stones. She lost track of time, her excitement for capturing the forest's eerie beauty outweighing her creeping sense of unease. But when she finally checked her phone, she realized it was already past 5 p.m. The sky was starting to darken, and she knew she should start heading back. But as she turned to retrace her steps, she noticed something strange. The path she'd been following was gone, swallowed up by the dense undergrowth. She tried to follow her own footprints, but they seemed to have faded away, like the forest itself was erasing her presence. Panic began to set in as she realized she had no idea where she was. Rachel tried to stay calm, telling herself she could find her way back if she just retraced her steps carefully. But the forest seemed different now, darker, colder, and more menacing. The trees loomed over her, their twisted branches reaching down like claws, and strange shadows flickered at the edge of her vision. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that something was following her, just out of sight. After wandering in circles for what felt like hours, she began to hear it, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. It was distant at first, but it grew louder with every step she took. It sounded like someone was tapping on a hollow tree trunk, a slow and deliberate rhythm that seemed to echo through the trees. "Hello," she called, hoping maybe it was another hiker, someone who could help her find her way out. But there was no answer, only the tapping, growing louder and closer. She turned in circles, trying to figure out where it was coming from, but it seemed to be coming from all around her. Then, in the dim light, she saw it, a figure standing a few yards away, half hidden by the shadows. It was a man, tall and thin, with pale skin and dark, hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through her. He was dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothes, and he was tapping on a tree with a long, thin stick. Rachel froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The man tilted his head, as if studying her, and then he smiled, a slow, unnatural smile that sent a chill down her spine. "Are you lost?" he asked in a voice that was barely more than a whisper. Rachel nodded, unable to tear her eyes away from him. The man pointed deeper into the forest. "The way out is that way," he said, his voice soft and melodic, like a lullaby. "Follow the path, and you'll be free." Rachel hesitated, but she was desperate. She glanced in the direction he was pointing, but there was no path, only darkness and dense trees. When she looked back, the man was gone. She was alone again, the forest silent except for the faint echo of his voice. Taking a deep breath, she started walking in the direction he'd pointed, hoping she'd find her way back. But the deeper she went, the darker and colder it became. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and the tapping sound began again, this time louder and faster. She broke into a run, her heart pounding, her flashlight barely cutting through the thick darkness. The tapping followed her, echoing through the trees, and she could hear footsteps now, soft and shuffling, keeping pace with her. She glanced over her shoulder, but there was nothing there, only shadows. Finally, she burst into a small clearing, gasping for breath. She looked around, hoping to see something familiar, but the clearing was empty, except for an old, weathered signpost. It was crooked, covered in moss, and the words were barely legible. But she could just make out the words. This way out. Relieved, she followed the sign, stumbling through the undergrowth. But as she walked, she noticed something strange. The trees around her were different now, twisted and blackened, their branches bare and reaching toward the sky like claws. The air was thick and heavy, and an eerie silence hung over everything. Then she saw it, another clearing up ahead, with a figure standing in the center. It was the man she'd seen before, standing perfectly still, his hollow eyes fixed on her. But this time, there was something different about him. His skin was even paler, almost gray, and his clothes were torn and stained with dirt. He looked more like a ghost than a man, a shadow from another time. "Are you still lost?" he asked, his voice echoing through the clearing. Rachel backed away, her heart pounding. "I just want to go home," she whispered, her voice trembling. The man tilted his head, his dark eyes gleaming. "There is no way home," he said softly. "Not from here." And then, before her eyes, he began to fade, his body dissolving into the shadows, until he was nothing more than a whisper in the wind. Rachel turned and ran, her flashlight flickering as she stumbled through the trees. She didn't know where she was going. All she knew was that she had to get away. But no matter how far she ran, the forest seemed endless, a never-ending maze of twisted trees and dark shadows. Eventually, her flashlight died, leaving her in complete darkness. She fell to her knees, exhausted, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. She closed her eyes, hoping that when she opened them, she'd wake up and find herself safe at home. But when she opened her eyes, she was still in the forest, surrounded by darkness and silence. And there, just beyond the edge of her vision, she saw him again, the man with the hollow eyes, watching her, waiting. Rachel was never seen again. Her parents and friends searched the forest for weeks, but they found no trace of her. The only thing they found was her camera, lying in the middle of a small clearing, its battery dead and its memory card empty. One crisp autumn afternoon, Alex decided he'd check out Pine Hollow for himself. He grabbed his backpack, packed some snacks, a flashlight, and his camera, and headed off on his bike. He figured he'd explore for a few hours and get back before dark. When he arrived at the edge of the forest, he noticed how quiet it was. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie silence that seemed to press down on him. Still, Alex shrugged it off and walked into the forest, eager to see what he'd find. The deeper he went, the darker it became. The trees grew thicker and closer together, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. Alex started taking pictures, marveling at the strange beauty of the forest. But as he wandered further in, he began to notice something strange. The paths seemed to shift, as if they were changing behind him. Every time he looked back, the trail he'd just come from looked different, almost like the forest was trying to confuse him. After a while, Alex realized he was lost. He checked his phone for a signal, but there was nothing. He tried to stay calm, telling himself he'd find his way back if he just retraced his steps. But the forest seemed different now, darker, colder, and more menacing. A chill ran down his spine as he realized he couldn't hear anything. No animals, no rustling leaves, just silence. Then, he heard it, a faint sound, like someone walking through the leaves. He turned, expecting to see someone, maybe another hiker. But there was no one there. He called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" But his voice seemed to be swallowed by the trees. Alex kept walking, his heart pounding, and the sound of footsteps continued, always just behind him. He tried to walk faster, but no matter how fast he went, the footsteps stayed close, following him, echoing through the silent forest. Finally, he saw a faint light up ahead, like a clearing. He hurried toward it, desperate to get out of the dark, oppressive woods. When he reached the clearing, he stopped dead in his tracks. In the center of the clearing was a small, old cabin, its windows dark and its roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. Alex wasn't sure why, but he felt drawn to the cabin. He walked up to the door, reaching out to knock, but as soon as his hand touched the wood, the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and mold, and a cold, eerie silence filled the room. He took a step inside, his flashlight casting long shadows across the floor. The cabin was empty, just a few broken chairs and a dusty table. But on the far wall, he noticed something strange. A series of old photographs pinned up, faded and yellowed with age. He stepped closer, squinting to make out the faces in the pictures, and a chill ran down his spine. The photos showed people, men, women, and even children. standing in the forest, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Some were pointing, others had their hands over their mouths, but all of them looked like they'd seen something horrible. Alex felt a knot of fear tightening in his stomach. The people in the photos looked familiar. Not like people he knew, but familiar in a different way, like he'd seen them before in a dream or a nightmare. And then, in the corner of one of the photos, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A small figure, half hidden in the shadows, watching the people with dark, hollow eyes. He stumbled back, his heart pounding. He had to get out of there. He turned and ran out of the cabin, back into the dark forest. But as he tried to retrace his steps, he realized he was completely lost. The trees seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the path was nowhere to be found. Then he heard it again, the sound of footsteps, closer this time, echoing through the trees. He looked around, his flashlight flickering, but there was no one there. Panic began to set in as he realized he was alone, truly alone in the heart of Pine Hollow. But he wasn't alone. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a shadow move, slipping between the trees. It was tall and thin, with long, twisted limbs and dark, hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through him. Alex turned and ran, his heart pounding, his breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. He ran for what felt like hours, but no matter how far he went, the footsteps followed, always just behind him, always just out of sight. He could feel the figure watching him, its cold, dark presence pressing down on him, filling him with a sense of dread he'd never felt before. Finally, he stumbled into another clearing, gasping for breath. But as he looked around, he realized something terrifying. He was back at the cabin. The same old, decaying structure stood before him, its windows dark and empty. And there, pinned to the wall, were the same photographs, only this time, there was a new one. A photo of him, standing in the forest, his face frozen in terror. He backed away, his mind racing, and that's when he saw it, the figure, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching him with those hollow eyes. It began to move toward him, slow and deliberate, its limbs stretching out like twisted branches. Alex turned and ran, but the figure followed, its footsteps echoing through the trees. He ran until his legs ached, until his lungs burned, but no matter how fast he went, he couldn't escape. The forest seemed to close in around him, trapping him, leading him back to the same places over and over. Eventually, he collapsed, too exhausted to run anymore. He looked up, his vision blurry, and saw the figure standing over him, its hollow eyes staring down at him. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached out, its hand cold and skeletal, and everything went black. Days later, a search party was organized to find Alex. They combed through Pine Hollow, calling his name, but found no sign of him. His family and friends refused to give up, searching day after day, but it was as if he'd vanished into thin air. Then, one day, a hiker stumbled across an old cabin in the heart of Pine Hollow. Inside, they found a wall covered in old photographs, each one showing a different person, their faces frozen in terror. And there, among the photos, was a new one. A picture of Alex, standing in the forest, his eyes wide with fear. This story is about two best friends, Ethan and Mason. They were seniors in high school and both loved hiking and exploring the outdoors. They'd gone to Graywood a couple of times during the day, just on the outskirts, but they'd always stuck to the main trails. It was late October, a week before Halloween, and the boys decided they wanted an adventure. They dared each other to spend a night camping deep in the woods, far from any of the marked paths. It was risky, sure, but they weren't afraid. They laughed it off, packed their gear, and set out on a cool Friday afternoon, excited for their overnight challenge. Their parents warned them to be careful, and they promised they'd stick together and stay safe. As they left, Mason's little sister begged him not to go. She told him she'd heard the story of Old Gray, a shadowy figure people claimed to have seen wandering in Graywood Grove late at night. He was rumored to be the ghost of a hermit who disappeared in those woods years ago. But Mason laughed it off, saying it was just a spooky story to keep kids out of the forest. The boys arrived at Graywood around 4 p.m. They parked near the entrance, slinging their backpacks over their shoulders and checking their map. The plan was simple: hike a couple of hours, set up camp, and spend the night listening to the sounds of the forest. They brought flashlights, a tent, sleeping bags, snacks, and even a little handheld radio. With all that gear and each other's company, they felt more than prepared. As they walked deeper into the forest, the light began to fade, and the familiar sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves seemed to disappear. The further they went, the quieter it became, until all they could hear was the crunch of leaves under their boots and the occasional distant creak of trees swaying in the breeze. They joked around to keep their spirits up, but each of them felt an unsettling silence creeping in. They found a small clearing to set up camp just as dusk fell, and they got the tent pitched and a small fire going. For a while, everything was fine. They talked, told ghost stories, and shared snacks by the fire. The strange quietness of the forest seemed to melt away with their laughter. But as the night deepened and the forest around them grew pitch black, the sense of unease returned, stronger this time. Around midnight, Ethan got up to fetch more firewood. He wandered a short distance from the camp, using his flashlight to pick out fallen branches. He thought he'd heard footsteps nearby, but when he called out to Mason, there was no answer. He shrugged it off, figuring it was just the wind or maybe a small animal. But as he gathered the wood, the feeling of being watched became so strong that he couldn't ignore it. He glanced over his shoulder and saw a figure standing between the trees, just at the edge of his flashlight's beam. It looked like a man, tall and thin, with long, messy hair and dark clothing. Ethan's heart raced as he stared, frozen in place. He blinked, and the figure was gone. He ran back to the camp, his breath coming in quick gasps. When he got back, he told Mason about what he'd seen, but Mason just laughed, saying he was probably just seeing things. But Ethan couldn't shake the image of the figure. They both agreed to stay close to the campfire for the rest of the night. A couple of hours later, Mason's phone buzzed. He looked down to see a message, but when he opened it, the screen went blank. He tried to restart it, but nothing happened. It was as if his phone had died completely, even though it had been fully charged when they'd set out. When he looked up, he noticed something strange. The mist had started to roll in, thick and heavy, slowly wrapping around the trees like a living thing. The air felt colder, and the fire seemed to dim, casting long, flickering shadows around them. Ethan checked his own phone, only to find that it too had stopped working. Panic started to creep in as they realized they had no way to contact anyone if something went wrong. They decided to put out the fire and get into the tent, hoping that if they just stayed put, everything would be fine by morning. As they huddled in the tent, they began to hear strange sounds outside. Soft footsteps, like someone circling their camp, and the faint rustle of leaves. Every now and then, they thought they heard whispering, but it was too quiet to make out any words. Mason whispered to Ethan that it was probably just animals, maybe deer or raccoons. But deep down, they both knew it didn't sound like any animal they'd ever heard. Then, the footsteps stopped. Everything went silent again, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was heavy, oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. Ethan was about to say something when he felt a cold breeze pass through the tent, followed by a low, raspy voice, as if someone was standing right outside, whispering his name. Ethan, Mason. They both froze, too terrified to move. The voice was soft but clear, and it sent chills down their spines. They held their breath, hoping it was just their imagination, but then they heard it again, closer this time. Come with me. Ethan couldn't take it anymore. He unzipped the tent and shined his flashlight outside, but there was no one there, only the swirling mist and the shadows of the trees. He called out, "Who's there?" But the only answer was a low, eerie laugh that seemed to echo through the trees. They grabbed their bags, deciding to leave the tent behind and get out of the forest as quickly as possible. They started running, stumbling through the darkness, the mist thickening around them, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The trees seemed to close in on them, twisting and bending, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Every few steps, they heard the voice calling to them, whispering their names, urging them to come closer. Sometimes it sounded far away, other times it was right beside them. They tried to ignore it, focusing only on getting out, but the forest felt endless, like they were running in circles. Finally, they saw a faint light in the distance. It looked like a lantern, bobbing up and down as if someone was carrying it. Desperate for help, they ran toward it, shouting for whoever it was to wait. But as they got closer, the light suddenly vanished, leaving them in total darkness. They stopped, gasping for breath, trying to figure out which way to go. That's when they saw it again. The figure Ethan had seen earlier, standing just a few feet away, watching them with cold, empty eyes. It was closer now, close enough that they could see the faint outline of its face, pale and ghostly, with a twisted smile that sent a chill down their spines. They turned and ran, not daring to look back, until they burst out of the trees and found themselves back at the edge of the forest. The mist was gone, the air was warmer, and the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. They looked back, but there was no sign of the figure, no sign of anything strange. When they got home, they told their families what had happened, but no one believed them. People said they'd probably just let their imaginations get the best of them. But Ethan and Mason knew what they'd seen, what they'd heard. A week later, Mason decided to go back to Graywood during the day to retrieve their tent. But when he got to the spot where they'd camped, it was gone. There was no sign that they'd ever been there. No fire pit, no footprints, nothing. To this day, neither of them can explain what happened that night. They never went back to Graywood, and they never spoke about the figure they'd seen, the voice that had called their names, or the strange mist that seemed to swallow the forest. But every now and then, they both hear it, a faint, raspy voice, calling to them in their dreams, whispering their names, urging them to return to the forest of Graywood Grove. One fall evening, Hannah decided to explore the forest herself. She knew it was dangerous, but something about the mystery drew her in. She wanted to prove that the stories weren't real. She brought a flashlight, a small backpack, and her phone, and set off just before sunset, determined to spend only a few hours in the forest. The trees loomed high above her as she walked, their twisted branches stretching out like bony fingers. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the ground was soft underfoot, covered in a thick carpet of fallen leaves. Despite her excitement, a strange feeling of dread began to settle over her. The deeper she went, the quieter the forest became. There were no birds, no insects, just an eerie, endless silence. She kept walking, telling herself it was all just in her head. She tried to follow the path she'd mapped out, but somehow, the trail seemed to change. Every time she thought she recognized a landmark, like a large, gnarled tree or a moss-covered stone, it would be gone the next time she looked. It was as if the forest was shifting around her, confusing her, leading her deeper in. Just as the last bit of sunlight faded, she heard it, a soft, haunting lullaby drifting through the trees. Her heart skipped a beat, and she stopped, listening closely. The voice was beautiful yet sad, and it sent chills down her spine. She tried to ignore it, to keep moving, but the voice seemed to follow her, growing louder with every step. "Hello?" she called, hoping it was just another person lost in the woods. But there was no answer, only the soft, chilling song that seemed to float through the air. She told herself it was just the wind, just her imagination, but the fear was beginning to creep in. As she walked, the voice grew louder, and she realized it was singing her name, over and over. Hannah, Hannah. She felt her heart pound as she quickened her pace, desperate to find her way back to the edge of the forest. But no matter which direction she went, the trees seemed to close in around her, blocking her path, trapping her in a maze of branches and shadows. Her flashlight began to flicker, the beam of light growing dimmer with every passing minute. She checked her phone, but it had no signal. She was alone, surrounded by darkness and the haunting voice that called her name, luring her deeper into the forest. Then, just up ahead, she saw a faint light glowing between the trees. It looked like a lantern, bobbing up and down as if someone was carrying it. Hannah felt a surge of relief, thinking it was a hiker or maybe a forest ranger. She ran toward it, calling out, but as she drew closer, the light began to fade, slipping further into the trees. She followed the light, stumbling over roots and rocks, desperate to reach it before it disappeared. But just as she thought she was close enough to touch it, the light vanished completely, leaving her in pitch-black darkness. She stopped, her heart racing, and that's when she saw her. Standing in the shadows, just a few feet away, was a figure dressed in a long, flowing dress. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her hair hung in long, tangled strands around her face. The woman's eyes were dark, empty, and filled with an ancient sorrow. Hannah realized with horror that she was staring at the willow woman. Hannah tried to scream, but no sound came out. She took a step back, her mind racing. But the woman raised her hand and pointed, beckoning her forward. The haunting lullaby began again, soft and sweet, filling the air around her. Despite her terror, Hannah felt herself drawn to the woman, as if an invisible force was pulling her closer. The woman turned and began to walk deeper into the forest, her figure fading in and out of the shadows. Hannah tried to resist, to turn back, but her legs seemed to move on their own, following the willow woman further into the darkness. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time seemed to lose all meaning as she followed the figure through the twisted, endless maze of trees. The forest grew darker, colder, and the air was filled with the sound of whispers, voices calling her name, urging her to keep going. Finally, they reached a small clearing, and in the center of it was an ancient, gnarled willow tree. Its twisted branches hung low, draped in long, thin tendrils that looked like skeletal fingers. The willow woman stood beside the tree, her empty eyes fixed on Hannah, her mouth curved in a sad, haunting smile. Hannah felt her knees go weak as she stared at the tree. Its bark was covered in strange carvings, symbols she didn't recognize, and beneath the roots were piles of stones, each one engraved with a different name. She realized with horror that they were grave markers, the resting places of those who had disappeared into Black Willow Grove. The willow woman pointed to an empty spot beneath the tree, and Hannah felt a chill run down her spine. She understood now. This was her final resting place, the place where she would disappear, just like all the others. The forest had claimed her, and there was no escape. Desperate, she turned to run, but the forest closed in around her, the trees forming a barrier, trapping her in the clearing. She could feel the presence of others, shadowy figures moving through the trees, watching her with sad, hollow eyes. She realized they were the spirits of the missing, forever bound to the forest, lost and forgotten. The willow woman stepped forward, her hand reaching out, and Hannah felt an icy grip wrap around her wrist. She struggled, but it was no use. The woman's grip was as strong as steel, pulling her closer to the willow tree, to the dark, twisted roots that would be her grave. As the world around her faded to black, the last thing she heard was the soft, haunting lullaby, the willow woman's voice singing her name, lulling her into an eternal sleep. The next morning, when Hannah's parents realized she hadn't come home, they organized a search party. They combed through Black Willow Grove, calling her name, searching every inch of the forest. But there was no sign of her, no footprints, no belongings. She had vanished without a trace. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no sign of Hannah. The townspeople whispered about her disappearance, adding her name to the long list of those who had been lost to the cursed forest. Some claimed to have seen her, a pale figure wandering between the trees, her face sad and empty, forever trapped in the darkness of Black Willow Grove. And sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind blew just right, people claimed they could hear it, the haunting lullaby of the willow woman, singing softly, calling out to those who dared to enter the forest. They said that if you listened closely, you could hear her calling the names of the lost, urging them to come closer, to join her beneath the twisted branches of the willow tree. Years later, hikers found something strange in Black Willow Grove. Near an ancient willow tree, they discovered a small pile of stones, each one engraved with a name. And there, beneath the twisted roots, they found a single stone with a new name carved into it. Hannah. People say that if you stand in that clearing at dusk, you can still hear her voice, calling out from the shadows, forever lost in the haunted forest of Black Willow Grove. And those who hear it, they say, are never quite the same. For the forest has a way of claiming those who wander too far into its depths, trapping them in its dark embrace. just like the willow woman herself. This is the story of a boy named Sam and his cousin, Oliver. They were both in their teens, and they shared a love for adventure and exploring hidden places. Sam's family lived near Cold Hollow, and every summer Oliver would come to visit. Together, they would roam the forests, rivers, and valleys surrounding Sam's house. But there was one place they hadn't dared to explore: Cold Hollow. That summer, on a particularly hot day, Oliver suggested they finally give Cold Hollow a try. They both knew the stories about it, of course, but they figured that with two of them, they'd be fine. Besides, they'd hiked through forests before, and they knew how to keep their bearings. It was just another forest, after all. They packed their bags with water, snacks, flashlights, and a small map Sam's dad had drawn up for them, showing the trails he used to walk years ago. Sam's dad had warned them to stay close to the main path if they ever went in, but Sam figured they wouldn't need it. He felt a thrill at the idea of finally venturing into Cold Hollow and coming back with a story that would make everyone jealous. They set off around noon, the sun high above them as they stepped into the cool shadows of the forest. The moment they entered, they felt the temperature drop, as if they just walked into a refrigerator. The sunlight barely broke through the thick canopy above, and the only sounds were the soft rustle of leaves and their own footsteps on the forest floor. It was quiet, almost too quiet. The boys laughed it off, joking that the forest was trying to scare them off with its eerie silence. They followed the narrow trail for about an hour, talking and snapping pictures along the way. The forest was beautiful, with massive trees stretching up like giants and strange, curling roots that twisted across the ground. But as they went deeper, the trail became harder to see, and the trees seemed to grow closer together, like they were closing in on them. At one point, they came to a fork in the path. Sam thought they should take the left trail, but Oliver insisted they go right, saying that it looked like it led further into the forest, where they might find something interesting. Sam agreed, and they took the right fork, thinking they'd be able to backtrack if they got lost. As they walked, a strange fog began to creep in, swirling around their feet and making it difficult to see the path. Sam looked down at his watch and realized it was already late afternoon. They'd been walking for hours without realizing it. He told Oliver they should probably turn back, but Oliver shrugged, saying they'd be fine. Sam couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the forest was playing tricks on them. The fog grew thicker, rising until it was up to their knees, and they could barely see a few feet in front of them. They tried to retrace their steps, but the trees all looked the same, and the trail had disappeared completely. Panic started to creep in as they realized they were lost. Oliver pulled out his phone to check the GPS, but there was no signal. Sam tried his, but it was the same. No bars, no way to navigate back. They called out for help, their voices echoing through the foggy silence, but there was no response. After a while, they decided to keep moving, hoping they'd eventually find the trail again. But the deeper they went, the stranger things became. They started to hear faint whispers, just on the edge of hearing, like distant voices carried by the wind. Sometimes they'd catch glimpses of shadowy figures darting between the trees, but whenever they tried to get a closer look, there was nothing there. The boys tried to laugh it off, telling each other it was just their minds playing tricks, but the whispers grew louder, and they could feel eyes watching them from the shadows. Sam felt a cold chill run down his spine and couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Then they stumbled upon something strange, a small clearing with a stone circle in the center. It looked ancient, the stones covered in moss and lichen, with strange symbols carved into them. Sam remembered hearing about old Native American legends of Cold Hollow, about how the forest was sacred and filled with spirits. He suddenly wished they'd never come. Oliver, however, was fascinated. He moved closer, examining the symbols, his fingers tracing the carvings. As he touched one of the stones, a loud crack echoed through the clearing, and the ground beneath them trembled. The fog thickened, swirling around them until they couldn't see anything beyond the stone circle. And then the whispers turned into voices. "Leave! You don't belong here." The voices were low, guttural, filled with an ancient anger that made Sam's skin crawl. He grabbed Oliver's arm, pulling him away from the stones, and they ran, stumbling through the fog, the whispers growing louder, following them through the trees. They ran blindly, not caring which direction they went, only wanting to escape the voices. But the forest seemed to shift around them, twisting and turning, leading them deeper into its dark heart. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt distorted, like a nightmare that wouldn't end. Their legs grew heavy, their breaths came in ragged gasps, but still, they ran, driven by an instinctive fear they couldn't explain. Finally, they came to a halt, exhausted and out of breath. The fog had lifted slightly, and they found themselves in another clearing, this one darker, with ancient trees that seemed to lean in, surrounding them. In the center of the clearing stood an old, decrepit cabin, half hidden by vines and moss. Sam wanted to leave, to keep running, but Oliver insisted they go inside, thinking they might find shelter or at least a place to rest. Reluctantly, Sam agreed, and they approached the cabin, the wooden boards creaking beneath their feet. The cabin was cold and dark, with a musty smell that made Sam's stomach churn. The walls were lined with strange carvings, similar to those on the stones, and there were old, tattered blankets on the floor. But the strangest thing was the feeling of being watched, as if the cabin itself was alive, waiting for them to make a mistake. Then they saw it, a journal lying on a dusty table. Oliver picked it up, flipping through the yellowed pages, his eyes widening as he read. The entries were written by someone named William, a trapper who had lived in Cold Hollow over 100 years ago. He wrote about how he'd been drawn into the forest by strange voices, how he'd felt compelled to follow them deeper and deeper until he couldn't find his way back. The last entry was chilling. The forest has claimed me. I see others now, shadows that whisper my name. I am lost, and soon I will be one of them. Sam felt a shiver run down his spine as he realized the trapper had never left the forest. He was one of the lost souls, the shadows that lurked in the trees. They had to get out now, but as they turned to leave, they heard a voice whispering their names. Sam, Oliver. The boys froze, their hearts pounding, and they saw him. A figure standing in the doorway, his eyes hollow, his face twisted with sorrow. It was the trapper, William, his ghostly form flickering in and out of view. He raised a hand, beckoning them to come closer. Panicking, they bolted past him, bursting out of the cabin and sprinting through the forest, the voices following them, calling their names, telling them to stay. They didn't stop running until they burst out of the trees, collapsing on the edge of the road. They looked back, but the forest was silent, the shadows retreating, and the fog lifting as if nothing had happened. They returned home, shaken and exhausted, but no one believed their story. The next day, they went back with a group of friends to find the cabin, but it was gone, the clearing empty, as if the forest itself had erased all traces of what had happened. Sam and Oliver never returned to Cold Hollow, and they never spoke of that night again. But sometimes, late at night, they could still hear the whispers, faint and distant, calling their names from the shadows of the forest, reminding them that Cold Hollow was always watching, waiting for its next visitors. Valley Pine Woods was nestled in a remote area of northern Minnesota. It wasn't the kind of place that attracted tourists. Only locals knew about it, and most of them avoided it. The forest had earned a reputation over the years as the forest that swallows people. Hikers, hunters, even entire search parties had entered the woods, never to be seen again. People claimed that Valley Pine had a way of trapping anyone who went too deep, leading them in circles until they were completely lost. Derek brushed off these stories, thinking they were just local myths. He'd explored plenty of haunted places before, and he always came out fine. He packed his gear, a flashlight, some snacks, water, and a compass, then headed out early in the morning, determined to spend a day exploring the forest and getting some photos of the remote landscape. The forest greeted him with a quiet stillness. The trees were tall and straight, their thick branches forming a dark canopy that filtered out most of the sunlight. Derek felt the temperature drop as he entered, the cool, damp air clinging to his skin. He looked around, impressed by the sheer size of the trees and the eerie beauty of the place. At first, everything seemed normal. He followed a narrow trail, carefully marking his path by snapping small branches on trees, a trick he'd picked up over the years to avoid getting lost. But as he ventured deeper, he noticed that the forest seemed different, as if it were alive and watching him. The first strange thing happened about an hour in. He checked his compass, but the needle spun in circles, refusing to settle on a direction. Frowning, Derek tapped it a few times, thinking it must be broken. He decided to rely on the landmarks he'd marked instead. As he walked, Derek noticed that the forest was unusually quiet. There were no birds, no insects, no sounds at all except for the crunch of his footsteps. The silence was so absolute that it made him uneasy. He kept telling himself it was just a quirk of the forest, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. After another hour, Derek stopped to rest and pulled out his water bottle. That's when he saw it. Someone had placed a small stone cairn nearby, a pile of stones stacked carefully on top of each other. It looked fresh, like someone had just built it. He hadn't seen it when he first walked by, and he was sure he hadn't wandered off the path he'd marked. But maybe he'd missed it in his excitement. Shaking it off, he continued deeper into the forest. But as he walked, he noticed more cairns, scattered here and there, each one more elaborate than the last. They seemed to form a trail, leading him further into the trees. Derek's curiosity got the better of him, and he began following the strange markers, wondering if they'd lead to something interesting. After a while, he came across a small clearing with an enormous tree at its center. This tree was different from the others. Its trunk was thick and twisted, with roots that snaked across the ground like the limbs of some ancient creature. Hanging from its branches were dozens of small, hand-carved wooden figures, each one weathered and crude, like eerie dolls suspended in the air. Derek felt a chill run down his spine. He took a few steps closer, examining the figures. They were human-shaped, with long limbs and hollow eyes, dangling from strings tied to the branches. He'd never seen anything like it before. The sight was both fascinating and unsettling. Just then, he heard something behind him, a soft whisper, like the rustling of leaves but more deliberate. He spun around, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing there. The forest was as silent as ever. Derek tried to shake off his growing unease. He was alone, he reminded himself, and the strange carvings were probably just the work of some local artist. But as he turned to leave the clearing, he saw something that made his blood run cold. One of the wooden figures was now lying on the ground, its strings severed as if someone had cut it. He could have sworn it had been hanging when he first saw it. He took a few steps back, his instincts telling him to get out of there, but then he heard it again. The whisper, louder this time, coming from somewhere deep in the trees. Derek. His name echoed through the forest, faint and distorted, as if carried by the wind. He froze, his heart pounding. He hadn't told anyone where he was going, and there was no one else in the forest. He was sure of that. But the voice had sounded familiar, like a friend calling from far away. He ignored the voice and started walking quickly back the way he'd come, following the marks he'd left. But something strange began to happen. The trees seemed to shift around him, their branches reaching out like arms, blocking his path. No matter which way he turned, he ended up back in the clearing with the twisted tree. Panic began to set in. He tried retracing his steps, carefully following each broken branch, but every time, he ended up back at the clearing. It was as if the forest itself were playing tricks on him, leading him in circles. Desperate, he pulled out his flashlight and shined it around, hoping to find something that would guide him out. But as the beam swept across the trees, he saw movement, shadowy figures darting between the trunks, their forms just barely visible in the darkness. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and echoing through the forest. They spoke in hushed tones, calling his name, pleading for him to stay, to join them. The voices were haunting, filled with sorrow and longing, like the cries of lost souls. Then he saw them, the figures in the trees. They were human-like, their bodies thin and twisted, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. Their faces were gaunt, almost skeletal, and their hands were stretched out, reaching toward him. "Derek, don't leave us." He stumbled back, his heart racing as he realized what he was seeing. These were the lost souls, The people who had disappeared in Valley Pine Woods. They were trapped here, bound to the forest, unable to escape. Derek turned and ran, his feet pounding against the forest floor as he sprinted through the trees, ignoring the twisting paths and broken branches. He could hear the whispers following him, growing louder and more desperate with every step. But no matter how fast he ran, the forest seemed to shift around him, blocking his way, trapping him in an endless maze. He felt the shadows closing in, their hollow eyes watching him, waiting for him to give in. He stumbled, falling to his knees, his flashlight slipping from his grip and rolling away. He reached out, desperate to find his way, but his hand landed on something cold and hard, a wooden figure, just like the ones hanging from the tree. The whispers surrounded him, filling his mind, drowning out his thoughts. He could feel the presence of the lost souls, their hands reaching out, pulling him deeper into the darkness. As his vision began to fade, he saw one last thing. The twisted tree, standing tall and silent, its branches heavy with new wooden figures. And there, hanging among them, was a new carving, one that looked just like him, with hollow eyes and a silent, open mouth. The next day, a search party went out to look for Derek. They combed through the forest, calling his name, searching for any sign of him. But Valley Pine Woods was vast, and the forest seemed to swallow their voices, echoing them back in eerie whispers. They found his backpack near the edge of the forest, along with a small pile of stones arranged in a neat cairn. But of Derek himself, there was no trace. Over the years, more people went missing in Valley Pine Woods, their names added to the growing list of those who had disappeared without a trace. Locals say that if you listen closely, you can still hear their voices, calling out from the shadows, begging to be found, forever lost in the depths of the haunted forest. This is the story of Mia, a high school senior who had grown up hearing tales of the woods. Like any other teenager, she was curious and fearless, always eager for adventure. When her friends suggested they go camping in Whispering Pines for the weekend, Mia jumped at the chance, excited to create unforgettable memories with her closest friends. Mia's friends included Jake, the jokester of the group, Sarah, the cautious planner, and Lucas, the quiet observer who always seemed to have a story up his sleeve. They set out early on a Friday morning, loading their backpacks with tents, sleeping bags, food, and plenty of snacks for their trip. As they drove toward the forest, Mia felt a thrill of excitement mixed with a tinge of fear. After all, she had heard the stories. When they arrived at the edge of the forest, the trees loomed tall and intimidating, their branches swaying softly in the breeze. Mia took a deep breath, shaking off her unease. "Let's make the most of it," she declared, trying to boost everyone's spirits. They hiked deeper into the woods, laughing and joking as they followed a narrow path. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Everything seemed perfect until they reached a clearing where the sunlight disappeared behind the trees, and the atmosphere grew heavy with silence. "Let's set up camp here," Jake suggested, throwing his backpack down. Mia hesitated, recalling the warnings about this part of the forest. She remembered her grandmother telling her to stay away from the northern section of Whispering Pines. But everyone else was already setting up their tents, and she didn't want to seem like a scaredy cat. As the sun began to set, they gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. It was a magical night filled with laughter, but as darkness fell, the forest transformed. Shadows stretched across the ground, and the whispers began. At first, it was just the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves, but then Mia swore she heard faint voices, like a conversation carried on the breeze. "Do you hear that?" she asked, glancing around. The others paused, listening intently. "It's just the wind," Lucas said, though his brow was furrowed with concern. But Mia wasn't so sure. The whispers seemed to call out to her, beckoning her to listen closer. Shaking off the feeling, she focused on the warmth of the fire and the company of her friends. As they settled into their tents for the night, Mia couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that crept over her. The whispers had turned into a soft hum, echoing in her mind as she lay in her sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of her tent. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, but sleep eluded her. Around midnight, she heard a soft rustling outside her tent. Heart pounding, she sat up, peeking out through the small opening. The moon illuminated the clearing, but there was no one in sight. Just as she was about to lay back down, she saw it. A shadow darting between the trees, too fast for her to make out any details. "Mia, you okay?" Jake's voice came from the adjacent tent. "Yeah, just thought I saw something," she replied, trying to sound braver than she felt. "Probably just a raccoon or something," he said with a chuckle. "Nothing to worry about." But Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whispers grew louder in her ears, almost forming words. They seemed to be calling her name. The next day, she would learn that the forest had a way of luring people in, making them feel at home while hiding its dark intentions. The following morning, the group decided to explore the deeper parts of the forest. Sarah, always cautious, suggested they stick to the trails, but Jake was eager for adventure. "What's the worst that could happen?" he laughed, leading the way. As they hiked, the atmosphere shifted again. The sun was hidden behind thick clouds, and the path grew narrower, lined with gnarled roots and thorny bushes. Mia felt a sense of foreboding creeping in as they ventured further away from their campsite. After a while, they stumbled upon a small pond, its surface reflecting the overcast sky. They decided to take a break and rest by the water. As they sat, Mia felt an overwhelming urge to wander closer to the edge of the pond. Something about it was drawing her in. "Hey, Mia, don't go too far," Lucas called, but she felt compelled to step closer. The whispers were stronger now, echoing in her mind, urging her to approach. As she knelt by the water, she saw her reflection, but something was off. The water rippled, distorting her image until it morphed into a figure standing behind her. Startled, she turned around, but there was no one there. The others were still chatting and laughing, completely unaware of the vision she had just witnessed. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, noticing Mia's pale face. "Yeah, she began, but the words caught in her throat. How could she explain what she had seen? After a few more minutes by the pond, Mia suggested they head back to camp. Everyone agreed, eager to make lunch and relax for the rest of the day. But as they retraced their steps, Mia felt an unsettling pull, as if the forest wanted to keep them there, to swallow them whole. Back at camp, the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting warm rays over the clearing. They set up a small picnic, and for a moment, the worries of the forest faded away as they enjoyed their meal. But the whispers returned, louder than before, weaving through their conversations. "Is it just me, or does it feel like we're being watched?" Lucas asked, looking around nervously. The others laughed, but Mia felt the weight of his words. It was true. The trees seemed to lean closer, as if they were listening, waiting. That night, they sat around the fire again, but the atmosphere had shifted. The laughter was forced, and the whispers grew more distinct, echoing through the woods like a haunting melody. Mia felt the urge to leave growing stronger, but she didn't want to ruin the fun for her friends. "Let's tell ghost stories," Jake suggested, trying to lighten the mood. They took turns sharing spooky tales, but as Mia's turn approached, she felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't want to share a story. She wanted to escape. Finally, she stood up. "I think I'm going to take a walk," she announced, unable to shake the feeling that she needed to get away from the fire, away from the whispers. "I'll be back in a few minutes." "Mia, wait," Sarah called, but she didn't look back. She walked into the darkness, leaving the warmth of the fire behind. As she ventured into the woods, the whispers enveloped her, growing louder, almost drowning out her thoughts. She felt a mix of fear and curiosity. What were they saying? Were they warnings, or were they inviting her deeper into the forest? Mia walked for what felt like hours, the trees closing in around her. The whispers were now a chorus, echoing her name, beckoning her to come closer. The air grew thick and heavy, and the shadows danced around her as if they were alive. Suddenly, she stumbled upon a clearing she hadn't seen before. In the center stood an old, crumbling stone structure covered in vines, its entrance dark and foreboding. The whispers grew frantic, urging her to step inside. She felt an overwhelming pull toward the structure, as if it were calling her home. Despite every instinct screaming for her to turn back, she approached the entrance. The air was thick with an otherworldly energy, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. As she stepped inside, the whispers grew louder, surrounding her, enveloping her in darkness. "Mia," they called, echoing in her mind. "Join us." The inside was dark, with shadows dancing along the walls. She squinted, trying to make out the shapes around her. But all she saw were the faint outlines of what appeared to be faces, hollow eyes staring back at her from the darkness. Panic surged through her. She turned to leave, but the entrance was gone, replaced by solid stone. The whispers crescendoed, drowning out her thoughts, pushing her deeper into the shadows. She stumbled back, her heart racing, but there was nowhere to go. "Join us," the voices chanted, their tone a mixture of sadness and longing. "You belong with us." Mia felt tears streaming down her face as she fought against the whispers. She remembered her friends, their laughter, and the warmth of the fire. They needed to know she was gone. She had to escape. With every ounce of strength, she pushed through the darkness, forcing herself back toward the entrance. As she ran, the shadows reached for her, trying to pull her back into the depths of the stone structure. But she fought against them, fueled by her desire to survive. Finally, she burst through the entrance, stumbling into the cool night air. The whispers faded, but a lingering chill clung to her as she collapsed on the forest floor, gasping for breath. This is the story of Sam, a 17-year-old who had heard the stories but was determined to explore Blackwood Hollow with his best friends, Mia and Kyle. They were the kind of friends who thrived on adventure, always seeking thrills and challenges. The summer before their senior year, they decided to hike into Blackwood Hollow for a weekend camping trip, convinced they could conquer any fears that the stories had instilled in them. As they packed their gear in the early morning light, Sam couldn't shake the feeling of excitement mixed with apprehension. He remembered the old man who worked at the local gas station, warning them not to enter the forest after dark. "You don't want to end up like the others," he had said, shaking his head. But the trio laughed it off, dismissing it as superstition. They drove to the edge of the forest, the towering trees casting long shadows over the narrow road. "Let's go," Kyle shouted, his enthusiasm infectious. They grabbed their backpacks and set off down the trail, ready for the adventure ahead. The first few hours were filled with laughter and exploration. They marveled at the lush greenery, the sound of birds chirping, and the rush of a nearby stream. As they ventured deeper into Blackwood Hollow, however, the atmosphere began to shift. The sunlight dimmed, the trees grew taller and closer together, and an eerie silence settled over the woods. "Do you guys feel that?" Mia asked, glancing around as the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. "It's like everything just went quiet. Probably just the dense trees blocking out the sound," Sam replied, trying to brush off the unease creeping in. "Let's keep moving." They hiked for hours, following a winding path that seemed to lead them deeper into the forest. After a while, they decided to take a break by a crystal-clear stream, the water sparkling in the fading light. As they sat on the rocks, enjoying their snacks, Sam couldn't help but notice how beautiful yet haunting the forest was. "Look at those trees," Kyle said, pointing toward a cluster of ancient oaks. "They're massive. I bet they've been here for centuries." "Yeah, and they probably have their share of stories to tell," Mia replied, her voice tinged with a hint of apprehension. "I just hope we don't end up in one of them." They laughed, but the unease hung in the air, thick and palpable. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor, they decided it was time to find a spot to set up camp. Finding a clearing surrounded by tall pines, they set up their tents and gathered firewood. The warmth of the fire soon chased away the chill of the night, and they settled in for an evening of ghost stories and laughter. As the darkness enveloped them, Sam felt a shiver run down his spine. The forest around them felt alive, whispering secrets in the wind. He pushed the feeling aside and joined his friends in sharing spooky tales, but as the stories grew darker, the laughter faded. "Have you guys heard about the old ranger?" Kyle began, his voice low and serious. "He used to patrol these woods years ago. Legend says he went missing one night, and they never found him. People say you can still hear his voice calling out for help on quiet nights. Ugh, that's creepy, Mia said, wrapping her arms around her knees. What if we're here when it happens? Sam chuckled nervously, but the thought sent a shiver through him. As they sat in the flickering firelight, the shadows seemed to grow longer, creeping closer to their little circle. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, and Mia gasped as a branch snapped nearby. Maybe we should get some sleep, Sam suggested, trying to lighten the mood. Tomorrow we'll hike to the lookout point. The sunrise will be worth it. Reluctantly, they crawled into their tents, the sounds of the forest wrapping around them. Sam lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his tent, the whispers of the night growing louder in his ears. Every rustle of leaves felt like a warning. He tried to convince himself it was just the wind, but deep down, he felt a gnawing sense of dread. Hours passed, and Sam finally drifted into a restless sleep. Suddenly, he was jolted awake by a loud crash outside his tent. Heart racing, he sat up, straining to listen. The forest was eerily silent again, but he could feel something was wrong. Sam? Mia's voice came from the tent next to him, shaky and frightened. What was that? I don't know, he whispered back, his throat dry. Stay quiet. The silence stretched on, but Sam could feel his heart pounding in his ears. He unzipped the tent slowly, peering outside. The moonlight illuminated the clearing, revealing the scattered remains of their firewood. But there was something else, a dark figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching them. Guys, there's someone out there, Sam whispered urgently, backing away from the opening. What? Kyle's voice was laced with disbelief. You're joking, right? I swear, there's someone. Before he could finish, the figure stepped into the moonlight. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that glowed eerily in the dark. He wore a tattered ranger's uniform, and his expression was one of anguish. Help me. The man's voice echoed, hollow and distant. Please, Mia screamed, and Sam felt a rush of adrenaline. Get back, he shouted, stumbling backward as the figure took a step closer, its mouth moving silently as if trying to communicate. Run, Kyle yelled, and they all bolted from their tents, adrenaline pushing them forward. They sprinted into the forest, the sounds of their footsteps echoing against the trees. The forest felt alive around them, shadows stretching and morphing as they raced deeper into the woods. The whispers returned, louder now, drowning out their panic. Sam glanced back, but the figure was gone. Still, he could feel its presence lingering, chasing them through the trees. Where do we go? Mia shouted, her breath coming in gasps. Just keep running, Sam yelled, but the forest twisted and turned, leading them in circles. They stumbled over roots and rocks, disoriented and terrified. Finally, they reached a small clearing, panting and exhausted. The whispers faded for a moment, leaving them in a heavy silence. What just happened? Mia gasped, looking around. I don't know, Sam replied, his heart racing. But we can't stay here. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder and more urgent. Help us! Join us! They chanted, filling the air with a chilling melody. We need to find a way out, Kyle said, his eyes wide with fear. Let's head back to the stream. We can follow it out of the forest. With no other option, they turned and sprinted toward the sound of flowing water. But the whispers followed them, echoing in their minds, drowning out their thoughts. The deeper they went, the stronger the pull of the forest became, as if it were trying to claim them. Finally, they reached the stream, the water glistening in the moonlight. They followed it upstream, desperate to escape. The whispers grew fainter, but the sense of being watched never left them. As they hiked, the trees began to thin, and Sam thought they might be close to the edge of the forest. But just then, he heard a splashing sound behind them. He turned to see the gaunt figure emerging from the shadows, its eyes glowing brighter than before. Help me, it pleaded, reaching out toward them. The voice echoed in their minds, pulling them closer, promising safety and relief. Don't look at it, Sam shouted, grabbing Mia's arm. Run! They sprinted faster, the sound of their hearts pounding in their chests as they raced against the pull of the forest. The figure's voice faded into the distance, but the darkness loomed behind them, trying to draw them back. Just as they thought they might escape, Sam slipped on the wet rocks and fell into the stream, splashing water everywhere. He fought to regain his footing as the cold water rushed around him. "Sam!" Mia screamed, reaching for him. "Go. I'll be okay," he shouted, trying to push himself up. But as he looked back, the figure was closer, its face twisted in anguish, the whispers urging him to stay. Mia and Kyle hesitated, but Sam shouted again, "Go! Don't wait for me!" With a determined push, he finally stood, splashing through the water, forcing himself to move away from the figure. It stopped at the edge of the stream, its hollow eyes watching him, and the whispers grew silent, leaving only the sound of the rushing water. "Come back!" it wailed, the voice echoing through the trees. But Mia and Kyle didn't stop. They ran, leaving Sam behind, their footsteps fading into. This story follows Emma, a curious 18-year-old who had lived her entire life in a nearby town. Emma had heard the tales of misty pines from her parents and grandparents, but instead of deterring her, these stories sparked her adventurous spirit. One sunny Saturday morning, Emma decided it was finally time to explore the forest for herself. "Are you really going to Misty Pines?" her best friend, Lily, asked with a hint of disbelief. They were sitting in the school cafeteria, the usual clamor of voices surrounding them. "Why not? Everyone makes it sound scarier than it is," Emma replied, confidence brimming in her voice. "I'll be fine. Just a few hours of hiking, and I'll be back before dinner." Lily frowned, worried for her friend. "Just be careful, okay? If you hear any strange noises or see anything weird, don't hesitate to turn back." "Sure thing," Emma laughed, brushing off her friend's concerns. Early the next morning, Emma packed her backpack with snacks, a water bottle, a flashlight, and a map of the trails. She wore sturdy hiking boots, ready for an adventure. As she drove to the entrance of Misty Pines, excitement bubbled inside her, overshadowing any lingering fears. Upon arrival, the forest seemed welcoming. Sunlight streamed through the trees, and the sound of birds chirping filled the air. Emma took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh scent of pine and earth. With each step, she felt more exhilarated. The forest was beautiful, and she was determined to enjoy every moment of her hike. As she walked deeper into Misty Pines, the path became less defined, surrounded by thick underbrush and towering trees. The sounds of the forest grew quieter, the chirping birds replaced by an unsettling silence. Emma noticed the shadows lengthening around her as she ventured further. "Just a little farther," she told herself, glancing at her watch. She had been hiking for about an hour, and while she hadn't seen anyone else, she felt fine. But as she continued on, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. After another 30 minutes of hiking, Emma came upon a small clearing. In the center stood an old, abandoned cabin, its wooden frame rotting and covered in moss. The windows were dark and dusty, and the door hung ajar, creaking slightly in the gentle breeze. Curiosity got the better of her. She approached the cabin cautiously, peering inside. The air was stale, and the faint smell of decay wafted toward her. Inside, the floorboards creaked under her weight, and she felt a chill run down her spine. "What a perfect place for a horror movie," she muttered to herself, trying to lighten the mood. Suddenly, Emma heard a noise coming from outside. It sounded like a child's laughter, distant yet clear. "What the?" she whispered. Looking around the cabin, she stepped back outside, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the forest, still and quiet. Shaking off the feeling of unease, Emma decided it was time to head back. As she turned to leave, she noticed something glimmering in the dirt near the cabin. Curious, she knelt down to investigate. It was a small, silver locket, intricately designed with a picture inside. Who would leave this here? She wondered aloud, opening the locket. Inside was a photo of a young girl with a wide smile, her eyes sparkling with joy. Emma felt a strange sense of sadness wash over her. It was a beautiful locket, But it was also a reminder of the stories she had heard about children going missing in these woods. Suddenly, the laughter echoed again, closer this time. Emma jumped to her feet, her heart racing. "Hello? Is someone there?" she called, hoping to find the source of the sound. But the forest remained silent. Panic crept in, and Emma decided it was time to leave. She retraced her steps back toward the trail, but everything felt different now. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, and the trees loomed over her like watchful guardians. As she walked, the laughter echoed again, now sounding almost like a taunt. "Come play with us," it called, and Emma's heart raced. She picked up her pace, her instincts screaming at her to get out of the forest. Minutes turned into what felt like hours as she stumbled through the underbrush, desperately trying to find her way back. She glanced at her phone, but there was no signal. "Great, just great," she muttered to herself, trying to stay calm. Finally, she reached a fork in the trail. Both paths looked equally worn, and she hesitated, trying to recall which way she had come. In the distance, she heard the laughter again, a haunting sound that echoed through the trees. "Emma, come play," it chimed, sending chills down her spine. "I'm not playing," she shouted back, her voice trembling. But deep down, she felt an inexplicable urge to follow the sound, as if something was drawing her in. Emma chose the left path, hoping it would lead her back to her car. The laughter faded, replaced by a low whispering that wrapped around her like a shroud. "Stay with us," it urged, and Emma felt her resolve weakening. "Leave me alone," she cried out, but the whispers only grew louder, swirling around her. The forest felt alive, each tree and shadow conspiring against her. The path seemed to shift beneath her feet, twisting and turning in ways she couldn't comprehend. Finally, she broke into a clearing, and in the center stood a group of children, their eyes wide with an otherworldly glow. They looked like the girl in the locket, smiling, inviting, yet something about their smiles felt wrong. Emma felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. "Come play with us, Emma," they chorused, their voices sweet yet chilling. "No, I have to go," Emma shouted, backing away. But the children advanced, their expressions shifting from joy to something darker. "Why don't you want to play?" one of the children asked, tilting her head. "We just want a friend." "I'm not your friend," Emma shouted, panic surging through her. She turned and ran, desperate to escape their grasp. As she sprinted back into the trees, the whispers followed her, weaving through the branches like a living thing. "Join us," they called, echoing in her ears, and Emma fought to keep her mind clear. She ran blindly, dodging branches and leaping over fallen logs. The forest was a maze, and every direction felt wrong. In the chaos, she tripped over a root and fell to the ground, gasping for breath. As she looked up, she saw shadows moving between the trees, closing in on her. "Help!" she screamed. But the only response was the laughter, now echoing ominously. "You can't escape. Stay with us." Gathering her strength, Emma pushed herself up and stumbled forward. She had to keep going, had to find her way out. The trees began to thin again, and in the distance, she spotted a glimmer of light, her hope. With renewed determination, she ran toward the light, the whispers growing fainter behind her. As she burst through the tree-line, she found herself back at the entrance of the forest, the sunlight bright and blinding. "Emma!" a voice called, and she turned to see Lily standing there, panic etched on her face. "I was so worried. I thought you were lost." Emma stumbled toward her, tears streaming down her face. I heard, there were children." "Children?" Lily asked, confusion crossing her features. "They wanted me to stay," Emma gasped, shaking her head. They were in the woods, and they kept calling for me." Lily's expression hardened as she grabbed Emma's shoulders. "We need to leave. Now." As they hurried to the car, Emma glanced back at the forest, the trees standing tall and imposing. The whispers had faded, but the memory of the children haunted her. What had she encountered in Misty Pines? She felt an overwhelming sense of loss for the girl in the locket and the children who had tried to lure her in. "Let's go," Lily urged. pushing Emma into the passenger seat before getting behind the wheel. They drove away from the forest, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her, that the whispers would linger in her mind forever. As they drove down the winding road, Emma glanced back at the dense trees. Misty pines loomed behind them, beautiful yet terrifying, its secrets hidden beneath the leaves. She knew she would never forget what she had experienced, nor the children who had called her name. And deep down, she understood that the forest would always be waiting, its whispers echoing through the trees, ready to draw in its next visitor. Jack had grown up hearing the tales from his grandmother, who often warned him with wide eyes and a shaky voice about the things that lurked in the woods. "You must never wander too deep, Jack," she would say, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "The forest holds secrets, and not all of them are meant to be uncovered." One crisp autumn afternoon, feeling rebellious and adventurous, Jack decided he would finally explore Whispering Pines. His friends, Sarah and Ethan, who shared his love for adventure, eagerly agreed to join him. "We'll just go for a hike," Jack assured them. "We'll be back before dark. It's just a forest, right?" With backpacks filled with snacks, water, and a flashlight, the trio set off toward the edge of Whispering Pines. The sun filtered through the golden and crimson leaves, creating a beautiful mosaic of light and color on the forest floor. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the sounds of Pine Hollow faded away, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. "See? It's not so scary," Jack said, his confidence evident. "Just a bunch of trees." Ethan chuckled, but Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. "Maybe we should stay close to the path," she suggested, glancing around nervously. "I've heard stories about people getting lost in here." Jack waved her concerns away. "We'll be fine. Let's check out that stream I heard about. It should be just a little further ahead." The friends continued on, following the narrow path that wound through the trees. As they walked, Jack shared stories about the forest's history, embellishing the tales of disappearances and mysterious sightings to impress his friends. The laughter and lightheartedness continued until they reached the stream, its water sparkling as it danced over the rocks. They settled by the water's edge, eating their snacks and enjoying the peaceful ambience. Jack tossed stones into the stream, while Sarah and Ethan dipped their toes into the cool water. But as they sat there, a strange feeling began to settle over Sarah. The forest felt too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. "Guys, do you ever get the feeling that we're being watched?" Sarah asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Ethan laughed it off. "It's just the trees. They're not alive, you know." But Jack frowned, a sense of unease creeping in as well. "I've heard that some people say the forest watches you. It's like it knows when you're there." "Okay, that's creepy," Sarah said, shivering despite the warm sun. "Let's just head back, okay? Just a little longer," Jack urged, standing up and looking deeper into the woods. "I want to see what's over that hill." Against her better judgment, Sarah and Ethan followed him up the hill, curious despite their fears. As they reached the top, they were met with a breathtaking view of the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. However, that beauty was soon overshadowed by a strange feeling in the pit of Sarah's stomach. "Okay, I think we should really head back now," she insisted, glancing around as the sunlight began to fade behind the trees. "It's getting late." Jack rolled his eyes, but reluctantly agreed. "Fine, let's head back." They began to descend the hill, but as they did, a thick fog rolled in, enveloping the trees and obscuring their view. "Where did the path go?" Ethan asked, his voice rising in panic. Jack squinted into the fog. "It was right here. I swear it was." Panic set in as they realized they had lost their way. The familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by a monotonous expanse of foggy trees. The quietness of the forest deepened, and the air felt heavy. "Maybe we should split up," Jack suggested, trying to remain calm. "One of us can find the path while the others wait here." "No way," Sarah exclaimed, her voice shaking. "We can't split up. That's how people get lost." Ethan nodded in agreement, fear evident in his eyes. "Let's just stick together and try to retrace our steps." With a deep breath, Jack led the way, retracing their route back toward the stream. The fog thickened, and soon they could barely see a few feet ahead of them. Jack's bravado began to wane as uncertainty settled in. "Is anyone else getting freaked out?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence. "It's way too quiet in here." "I don't like this," Sarah said, looking around nervously. "What if we can't find our way back?" Just as she spoke, a low, mournful sound echoed through the fog, sending chills down their spines. It was a distant call, almost like a child's cry, and it seemed to resonate from somewhere deep in the forest. "What was that?" Jack whispered, his heart racing. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her eyes wide with fear. "It sounded like a kid. Let's get out of here," Ethan said, grabbing Jack's arm. "We have to keep moving." They hurried in what they hoped was the direction of the stream, the cries fading into the distance. The forest felt alive, shadows moving just beyond their sight. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made them jump. As they pressed on, the cries returned, louder this time, echoing through the fog. "Help us! Help us!" they called, their voices haunting and eerie. "Is someone out there?" Jack shouted, but the only response was the thick silence of the forest. "Maybe we should follow the sound," Sarah suggested, but there was uncertainty in her voice. "No way. It could be a trap," Ethan argued, pulling Jack back. "We need to find our way back to the stream." But the pull of the cries was strong, and before they knew it, they were drawn deeper into the woods, the fog swirling around them like a living thing. "Guys, I think we're going in circles," Jack said, trying to maintain his composure. "We need to stop and think." As they huddled together, trying to calm their racing hearts, the air grew colder, and a heavy silence fell over them. The whispers began again, soft and melodic, weaving through the fog. "Join us, stay with us," they sang, and Sarah's heart raced in terror. "Guys, I don't think we're alone," she whispered, fear flooding her voice. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the fog, a girl, no older than 10, with wide, dark eyes and tangled hair. She stood just beyond the trees, her expression vacant and haunting. "Help me," she whispered, her voice echoing through the fog. "Please, help me find my friends." Jack's heart raced as he took a cautious step forward. "Where are they? We can help you." But the girl simply stared, the shadows around her growing thicker. "They're lost like you," she replied, her voice soft and haunting. "Stay with us. We can play together. Run," Ethan yelled, grabbing Jack's arm. The trio turned and sprinted away from the figure, the girl's voice following them. "Don't leave. Stay with us." They ran blindly through the fog, adrenaline surging as they stumbled over roots and rocks. The whispers morphed into frantic laughter, echoing all around them. "Join us! Join us!" the voices chanted, and Jack felt the weight of despair pressing in on him. "We can't stop," Sarah cried, tears streaming down her face. "We have to keep going." As they ran, the fog began to lift slightly, revealing a faint outline of a familiar path. Jack felt a glimmer of hope as they barreled toward it, the laughter fading behind them. They emerged onto the trail, and in the distance, they spotted the stream. "There!" Jack shouted, relief flooding his voice. They sprinted toward the water, the sound of flowing water acting as a beacon in the fog. As they reached the stream, they stumbled to a halt, gasping for breath. "We made it!" Ethan exclaimed, relief washing over him. But as they caught their breath, a sense of dread washed over them. The whispers returned, swirling around them like a storm. "You can't leave. Stay with us," they called, echoing in their minds. "Let's go. Now," Jack urged, leading the way along the stream. They hurried along the bank, the sound of the water growing louder with each step. But just as they thought they were safe, the fog rolled in again, thick and suffocating. They could barely see the path ahead, the trees closing in around them. "We have to find a way out," Sarah yelled, her voice tinged with panic. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the fog, blocking their path. It was the girl again, her face twisted in anguish. "Why are you leaving?" she wailed. "We just want to play." Jack felt a wave of fear wash over him. 17-year-old Max had heard the stories countless times growing up. His grandmother often recounted the tale of a local boy named Tommy who disappeared while playing near the forest's edge. "They say the forest called to him," she would say, her voice trembling with fear. He was never seen again. Swallowed by the shadows of Blackwood, Max was intrigued, rather than frightened. He had always been fascinated by the forest, dreaming of exploring its depths and uncovering its secrets. As summer approached, he decided it was time to venture into Blackwood for himself. Armed with a backpack filled with snacks, a flashlight, and a sense of adventure, he planned a day hike, determined to face his fears. "Are you really going into Blackwood?" his friend Lucy asked, her brow furrowed with concern. They were sitting on the steps of the local park, the afternoon sun casting long shadows around them. "Yeah, why not?" Max replied, a cocky grin on his face. "I want to see what all the fuss is about." "It's just a forest." Lucy shook her head. "People go missing in there, Max. You should be careful." "Come on, Lucy," he said, brushing off her worries. "It's just a bunch of trees and maybe a few critters. I'll be back before dinner, I promise." The next morning, Max set off early, the sun rising over the horizon as he approached the forest's edge. As he stepped into Blackwood, he felt an overwhelming sense of excitement mixed with apprehension. The trees towered above him, their branches weaving together like a dark tapestry. The air was cool and thick with the earthy scent of damp soil and decaying leaves. As he walked deeper into the forest, the sounds of the outside world faded away. The chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves became the only music to his ears. He followed a narrow trail that meandered through the trees, the sunlight filtering through the canopy above, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. After a while, Max came upon a small clearing where a brook bubbled merrily over smooth stones. He decided to take a break and sat on a large rock, pulling out a snack. The peaceful sound of the water soothed him, and for a moment, he felt like he had the entire forest to himself. But as he ate, a strange feeling crept over him. The air around him grew still, and a sense of unease began to settle in his stomach. He glanced around, noticing how the shadows seemed to deepen, stretching out from the trees like fingers reaching for him. "Get a grip, Max," he muttered to himself, shaking off the feeling. He finished his snack and decided to continue exploring. After all, he was just getting started. He wandered deeper into the forest, following the brook as it twisted and turned. The path began to narrow, and the underbrush grew thicker. Suddenly, he heard something, a soft, distant whispering that seemed to drift through the trees. It was a gentle sound, almost like a lullaby, but something about it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Max stopped, straining to listen. "Hello?" he called, his voice sounding small in the vastness of the forest. "Is anyone there?" The whispering continued, now rising and falling like the wind. Curiosity and fear battled within him, but he felt an inexplicable pull toward the sound. Against his better judgment, he stepped off the path and moved toward the direction of the whispers. As he walked, the air around him grew colder. The whispering grew louder, clearer, yet still incomprehensible. He followed it through the thick underbrush, the branches scratching at his arms and face. The forest felt alive, and he could almost sense it watching him. Finally, he emerged into another clearing, but this one was different. It was darker, the trees surrounding it more twisted and gnarled. In the center stood an ancient stone well, its mouth shrouded in darkness. The whispers swirled around him, now almost frantic, urging him to come closer. "Max, come play with us," the voices called, sweet and enticing. He hesitated, a cold shiver running down his spine. "Who's there?" he called, but the only answer was the wind rustling through the leaves. Suddenly, he felt a strong urge to approach the well. He stepped forward, peering into its depths. The darkness seemed endless, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him down there. "Max!" A voice broke through the fog of confusion. It was Lucy, her frantic shout snapping him back to reality. He turned, his heart racing. "Lucy, how did you find me?" he asked, bewildered. "I came looking for you," she said, her eyes wide with fear. "You've been gone for hours." I was worried sick. Max looked around, the shadows closing in as he realized how far he had strayed from the path. I don't know how I got here. I followed the whispers, and they led me to this well. Lucy stepped closer, her expression shifting from fear to concern. We need to leave. Now. This place gives me the creeps. But just as they turned to go, the whispers returned, more insistent than before. Stay with us. Play with us, they beckoned, wrapping around them like a thick fog. Run, Lucy shouted, grabbing Max's arm and pulling him away from the well. They dashed back through the clearing, the whispers now echoing in their ears, almost like laughter. They sprinted back through the underbrush, branches clawing at their clothes as they navigated the thick trees. Max's heart pounded in his chest as they stumbled through the forest, desperate to escape the clutches of whatever had lured him in. Which way is the path? Lucy panted, her breath coming in gasps. I don't know. I thought it was this way, Max replied, panic rising in his throat. As they continued to run, the whispers grew louder, drowning out their own voices. Stay with us. Join us, they chanted, and Max felt a sense of despair creeping in. He was losing himself to the darkness. Suddenly, they burst into another clearing, and Max skidded to a stop. In the center stood a circle of stone markers, ancient and weathered, with strange symbols etched into their surfaces. The air felt charged with energy, and the whispers morphed into a deafening roar, echoing around them. What is this place? Lucy asked, fear evident in her voice. I don't know, but we have to get out of here, Max shouted, feeling the weight of the forest pressing in on them. The ground beneath them began to tremble, and shadows flickered at the edges of the clearing. Max and Lucy stumbled backward, their eyes wide with terror as the whispers transformed into angry shouts. You can't leave. You're ours now, they cried. In a moment of sheer panic, Max grabbed Lucy's hand, and together they bolted toward the edge of the clearing. They raced through the trees, the forest alive with shadows, branches reaching out like hands trying to stop them. Keep running, Max shouted, but the weight of the darkness pressed heavily on their chests, and exhaustion began to seep into their bones. As they sprinted, the whispers became a cacophony of voices, echoing in their minds. Stay, join us, forever, they chanted, drowning out their own thoughts. Finally, they burst through the tree-line and found themselves back at the brook. Gasping for breath, they skidded to a halt, the sound of water soothing their frayed nerves. We made it, Lucy exclaimed, relief washing over her. But as they turned to look back at the forest, the whispers lingered in the air. They felt a chilling presence behind them, as if the forest was watching, waiting for its next chance to pull them back into its depths. We need to get back to town, Max said, his heart still racing. They followed the brook downstream, the sound of water grounding them as they navigated their way back. As they reached the edge of the forest, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. Max glanced back at Blackwood, its trees standing tall and imposing against the fading light. Let's not come back here, Lucy said, her voice shaky. Max nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of what they had experienced. The forest had secrets, dark, twisted secrets that should remain buried. He couldn't shake the feeling that the whispers would follow him, a haunting reminder of the danger lurking just beyond the trees. As they made their way back into town, the sun setting behind them, Max couldn't help but glance back at Blackwood Forest. The whispers had faded, but the sense of unease lingered in his heart. He had come seeking adventure, but what he found was far more sinister than he could have imagined. In the weeks that followed, Max and Lucy tried to forget their experience. They avoided the forest, sticking to the safety of the town, but every now and 17-year-old Emma had heard the stories from her parents and grandparents. They spoke of hikers who ventured into the elderwood, drawn by its beauty, only to vanish without a trace. The most chilling tale was about a group of friends who went camping in the woods one summer, only to be found the next day, empty tents and all, but no sign of the friends themselves. The townspeople said the forest had taken them, that it had a way of luring in the unsuspecting and then swallowing them whole. Despite the warnings, Emma was drawn to the elderwood forest. The tales only fueled her curiosity. She felt like the forest held secrets waiting to be uncovered. One late Saturday afternoon, as summer began to wane, she decided it was time to explore the woods herself. "I'll just take a quick hike," she told her best friend, Jake, who was less enthusiastic about the idea. "I'll be back before dark. It'll be fine." "Emma, I really think you should reconsider," Jake said, his brow furrowed with concern. "The stories about the disappearances are real. You can't just brush them off." Emma waved her hand dismissively. "Come on, it's just a forest. I'll stick to the paths. You worry too much." With a reluctant nod, Jake agreed to accompany her. "Okay, but we're sticking together the whole time," he insisted, grabbing his backpack filled with snacks and a flashlight. They entered the forest, the sunlight filtering through the leaves, casting patterns on the forest floor. The scent of pine and damp earth filled the air, and Emma felt a thrill of excitement coursing through her. As they walked along the narrow trail, the sounds of the town faded away, replaced by the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. Emma and Jake chatted as they walked, sharing stories about their summer adventures, but soon the atmosphere began to shift. The air felt heavier, and the trees loomed taller, their branches intertwining like fingers trying to hold them back. Emma glanced at Jake, who looked increasingly uneasy. "Are you sure you want to keep going?" he asked, a hint of worry in his voice. Emma hesitated, glancing around. "We've only been walking for a little while. Let's just go a bit further." They pressed on, deeper into the heart of the forest, the trail winding around ancient trees and thick underbrush. After a while, they stumbled upon a small clearing with a tranquil pond at its center. The water was so clear that they could see the smooth stones at the bottom, and the reflection of the trees around it created a serene picture. "This is beautiful," Emma exclaimed, sitting on a nearby rock and taking a sip of her water. "I'm glad we came." Jake, still uneasy, scanned the trees surrounding them. "It's nice, but we should really head back soon." "Oh, come on," Emma insisted, rolling her eyes. "Just relax for a minute. It's not like we're going to get lost." They spent a few moments enjoying the peaceful setting, but as they sat in silence, Emma felt a chill run through the air, causing her to shiver. She looked around, sensing that something was off. The forest felt too quiet, as if it was holding its breath. "Do you hear that?" Emma asked, suddenly alert. Jake furrowed his brow. "Hear what?" "It's like whispering." She strained her ears, and sure enough, a faint sound floated through the trees, soft and indistinct. Jake's expression turned serious. "I don't like this, Emma. Let's go back." Just then, the sound of footsteps broke through the whispers, echoing around them. Emma and Jake exchanged startled glances. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yeah," Jake replied, his eyes wide. "We need to get out of here." They quickly gathered their things and made their way back toward the trail, but as they turned, they found themselves disoriented. The trees looked different, their shadows stretching ominously in the dim light. "Which way do we go?" Emma asked, panic rising in her chest. "I think it was this way," Jake said, pointing uncertainly into the thick woods. As they moved deeper into the forest, the whispers grew louder, swirling around them like a tempest. "Stay with us. Join us," they beckoned, and Emma felt a strange compulsion to follow the sounds. "Emma, focus," Jake shouted, tugging on her arm. "We need to stick to the path." But she was entranced, the whispers tugging at her mind. "I just want to see," she murmured, taking a step forward. "No, we're leaving." Jake pulled her back, desperation in his voice. "We can't stay here." As they hurried away from the whispers, the forest seemed to close in around them. The branches stretched out, almost as if trying to grab hold of them. They stumbled through the underbrush, adrenaline coursing through their veins as they fought to escape the unseen forces that seemed to be closing in on them. "Keep moving," Jake yelled, his breath coming in quick gasps. They finally emerged into another clearing, but this one felt different, darker, almost suffocating. In the center stood a weathered stone altar, covered in moss and vines, surrounded by trees that appeared to lean toward it, as if they were drawn to its presence. The air felt charged with an unsettling energy, and Emma's heart raced in her chest. "Emma, we need to get out of here now," Jake urged, pulling her back. But before they could turn, a shadow flickered at the edge of the clearing. It was a figure, a young girl with dark hair and pale skin, standing just beyond the trees. Her eyes glimmered with an eerie light, and she raised a finger to her lips, shushing them. "Don't be afraid," she said, her voice sweet but chilling. "Stay and play with us." Emma felt her resolve weakening. There was something almost hypnotic about the girl's voice, pulling her closer. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're waiting for you," the girl replied, stepping forward. "You can stay here forever. Just come with me." "Emma, don't," Jake shouted, stepping in front of her. "We need to go." But it was too late. The girl's voice echoed in Emma's mind, drowning out her thoughts. The shadows around them seemed to twist and turn, pulling her in every direction. Suddenly, the air turned icy, and the whispers erupted into a chaotic chorus. "Join us, stay with us," they cried, the forest thrumming with energy. Emma felt a sharp pain in her chest, the urge to run battling against the need to stay. "Run," Jake yelled, grabbing her arm and pulling her away from the altar. They tore through the clearing, desperate to escape the nightmare that was unfolding around them. As they ran, the trees seemed to shift, the path obscured by the thickening fog. The whispers morphed into screams, echoing through the air like a chorus of the damned. "You can't leave. You belong to us now." Max and Lucy dashed through the underbrush, branches scratching at their skin as they fought to find their way back. The sounds of the forest echoed around them, but all they could hear was the pounding of their hearts and the frantic whispers that chased them. "We can't keep this up," Jake gasped, his breath ragged. "We need to find the path," Emma shouted, panic rising within her. Just as they thought they would never escape, they stumbled upon a familiar brook, the same one they had seen earlier. "This way," Jake shouted, pulling Emma along the water's edge. They ran faster, the whispers fading behind them but still echoing in their minds. As they reached the edge of the forest, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow through the trees. They skidded to a halt at the tree lean, gasping for breath, relief washing over them. "We made it," Emma exclaimed, tears of fear and exhaustion streaming down her cheeks. But just as they turned to leave, the whispers returned, echoing in the space between them and the safety of town. "You can't escape. Stay with us." Max and Lucy hesitated, the forest looming behind them, dark and ominous. They felt its pull, the weight of its secrets pressing against them. "Let's go," Jake urged, pulling Emma forward. They sprinted back to Maplewood, the safety of the town drawing them in like a beacon. As they reached the edge of town, Emma glanced back at Elderwood Forest one last time. The trees stood tall, shadows flickering in the fading light. She could almost hear the whispers still calling to her, promising secrets and adventure. But Emma knew better now. The forest held darkness that was not meant to be uncovered, and she had no intention of returning. They had escaped, but the memories of that day haunted her. Every rustle of leaves, every whisper on the wind reminded her of. 18-year-old Rachel had grown up hearing the haunting stories from her grandmother, who had once lived in Riverbend. "Never stray from the path, dear," her grandmother would warn, her voice trembling. "The forest can take you if you aren't careful." Rachel had always been captivated by these stories, her imagination running wild with images of shadowy figures and eerie whispers beckoning from the depths of Eldermere. One sunny afternoon in late autumn, Rachel decided it was time to confront her fears. Armed with her trusty backpack filled with snacks, a map, and her camera, she set off toward the forest. Her friends had tried to dissuade her, cautioning her about the mysterious disappearances, but Rachel was determined to uncover the truth. "It's just a forest," she assured them. "I'll be careful. I'll stick to the main trails." As she entered the forest, sunlight streamed through the branches, illuminating the path ahead. The vibrant autumn leaves crunched beneath her feet, and the air was crisp and refreshing. Rachel felt a thrill of excitement as she ventured deeper into the woods, the sounds of the town fading behind her. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the earthy scent of damp soil and pine. The deeper Rachel walked, the more the forest seemed to come alive. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and the gentle trickle of a nearby stream provided a soothing backdrop. She snapped photos of the breathtaking scenery, capturing the beauty of the forest with each click of her camera. But as she wandered, a sense of unease began to creep in. The vibrant colors of autumn were quickly overshadowed by an eerie quiet. The birds had fallen silent, and the air felt heavy, as if the forest was holding its breath. Rachel shook off the feeling, convincing herself that it was just her imagination running wild. After an hour of hiking, she stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood an ancient stone well, its surface covered in moss and vines. The well seemed out of place, a relic of a time long forgotten. Rachel felt an inexplicable pull toward it, as if something were beckoning her closer. Just a quick look, she muttered to herself, stepping toward the well. As she peered into its dark depths, she caught a glimpse of something shimmering at the bottom. Curiosity piqued. She leaned in closer, her heart racing. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the clearing, sending a shiver down her spine. "Hello?" Rachel called, her voice echoing into the void. There was no response, only the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. A sense of foreboding washed over her, and she took a step back, shaking her head as if to dispel the strange feeling. "I should keep moving," she whispered, her heart pounding, but as she turned to leave, she noticed a flash of movement from the corner of her eye. Startled, she turned back toward the well, her breath catching in her throat. Emerging from the trees was a girl, no older than Rachel, with long dark hair and a pale complexion. She wore a tattered white dress that flowed around her like mist. The girl smiled, but there was something unsettling about her expression, an unnatural brightness that sent chills down Rachel's spine. "Hi there," the girl said, her voice soft and melodic. "What are you doing out here all alone?" Rachel hesitated, uncertain how to respond. "I'm just exploring," she managed to say, trying to keep her voice steady. The girl tilted her head, a curious look in her eyes. "You shouldn't be here. The forest can be a dangerous place for those who wander off the path." Rachel felt a flicker of fear, but pushed it aside. "I'll be fine," she said, forcing a smile. "I'm just taking some pictures." The girl's smile widened, revealing an unsettling sweetness. "I used to take pictures too, before I had to stay here." The air around Rachel felt thick, as if the very forest was closing in on her. She glanced back toward the well, its dark mouth yawning open like a hungry creature. "What do you mean by stay here?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling slightly. The girl took a step closer, her gaze locked onto Rachel's. "The forest likes to keep its secrets. If you listen closely, you can hear them." Rachel's heart raced, an instinctual urge to flee coursing through her. "I should really be going," she stammered, backing away from the girl. But the girl's expression turned serious. "You can't leave," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Once you come here, you belong to the forest." Panic surged through Rachel, and she turned to run, but the girl's voice stopped her in her tracks. "You can't escape." Rachel sprinted through the clearing, her heart pounding in her chest as she dashed down the path. The whispers of the forest filled her ears, echoing in a chaotic symphony that urged her to stay. "Join us. Stay forever." They beckoned, and she fought to block out the haunting melody. She ran deeper into the woods, the trees looming ominously around her, casting long shadows in the fading light. The whispers followed her, twisting and turning like smoke in the air. Rachel felt the forest pressing in on her, the branches clawing at her as she stumbled through the underbrush. "Help! Someone help me!" she cried out, but her voice was swallowed by the forest. Just when she thought she might be lost forever, she stumbled upon a familiar path, the one she had originally taken. Relief surged through her as she sprinted forward, the sound of her heart pounding in her ears. But as she reached the edge of the woods, a cold dread washed over her. The sun was setting, casting a fiery glow across the horizon. Rachel turned to glance back at the forest, her breath hitching in her throat. There, Standing at the edge of the trees was the girl. Her pale figure glowed in the dim light, her smile hauntingly bright. "You can't run from us, Rachel," the girl called, her voice echoing in the stillness. "You'll always belong to the forest." Rachel's heart sank as she turned and ran into the town, the comforting familiarity of Riverbend surrounding her. She rushed home, locking the door behind her, desperate to escape the horrors of the forest. But as night fell, she could still feel the girl's eyes on her, and the whispers of the forest echoed in her mind. In the days that followed, Rachel tried to shake off the memory of her encounter, but the forest haunted her dreams. She would wake in a cold sweat, the girl's voice echoing in her ears, calling her back to Eldermere. Despite her fear, a part of her was drawn to the mystery of the forest, a pull that felt almost magnetic. One evening, unable to resist any longer, Rachel decided to return to the forest. She gathered her courage, grabbed her camera, and headed out as twilight descended. The air was thick with tension as she stepped into the woods, the familiar sounds enveloping her. She could feel the whispers wrapping around her, inviting her deeper into the darkness. As she walked, memories of her previous visit flooded her mind. The girl, the well, the strange energy that had enveloped her. But there was also an undeniable curiosity, a need to understand what was truly happening in the forest. She soon found herself back in the clearing with the well, the moonlight casting an eerie glow over the stone. The air felt electric, and Rachel could sense that something was about to happen. She peered into the well again, the darkness swallowing the light. "Why did you come back?" a voice asked from behind her, causing Rachel to spin around. It was the girl, standing in the shadows, her eyes shimmering in the darkness. "I need to know what's going on," Rachel replied, her heart racing. "What do you mean I belong to the forest?" The girl stepped closer, her expression softening. "It's not just a forest. It's alive, and it wants to keep you. It wants to keep all of us." Rachel felt a wave of confusion wash over her. "Who are all of us?" "Those who have come before," the girl said, her voice low and melodic. "We were drawn here, just like you. The forest chose us." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. "You mean, you disappeared?" The girl nodded, her expression filled with a haunting sadness. "We all did. We heard the whispers and thought we could play, but now we're part of the forest. No, I won't let that happen to me," Rachel cried, backing away. "You can't escape your fate," the girl said softly, her eyes glimmering in the moonlight. "The forest will always find a way to keep you." Before Rachel could react, the forest erupted into chaos. Shadows danced around her, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. "Join us. Stay forever," they cried, the energy of the forest swirling around her. Fear coursed through Rachel as she turned to run. For Sarah, a curious and adventurous 17-year-old, these tales were nothing more than folklore. Her friends often joked about her boldness. She had a penchant for exploring the unknown and an insatiable thirst for adventure. On a chilly autumn afternoon, with the sun dipping low in the sky and casting long shadows across the ground, Sarah decided it was time to experience Greywood for herself. "Are you sure you want to go there?" her best friend, Mia, asked, a hint of concern etched on her face. "I mean, everyone says it's dangerous." Sarah waved off Mia's worry. "Come on, it's just a forest. I'll stick to the trails and be back before dark. Besides, I want to take some photos for my project." Mia sighed, but eventually relented. "All right, but I'm coming with you. If you're going to get yourself into trouble, I might as well be there to rescue you." With her camera slung around her neck and a backpack filled with snacks, the two girls set off toward Greywood Forest. As they approached the entrance, the towering trees loomed overhead, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, and a shiver ran down Sarah's spine, but she brushed it off as excitement. They stepped onto the winding path, surrounded by the vibrant colors of autumn. Golden yellows, fiery reds, and deep oranges painted the landscape. For a while, they chatted and laughed, the sounds of the forest melting away their worries. But as they ventured deeper into Greywood, The laughter began to fade, replaced by an eerie silence that felt almost suffocating. "Do you feel that?" Mia whispered, glancing around nervously. "It's like the forest is watching us." Sarah shrugged, trying to maintain her bravado. "It's just quiet. Let's keep going." They walked on, but the deeper they ventured, the more oppressive the silence became. The air felt heavy, and the once vibrant colors of the forest seemed to dull, as if the trees were holding their breath. A chill ran through the air, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As they reached a clearing, they spotted a large, gnarled tree at its center. Its twisted roots snaked across the ground like the fingers of a giant. Intrigued, Sarah stepped closer, her camera poised to capture the unusual sight. "Look at this tree, Mia. It's amazing." Mia hesitated, eyeing the tree warily. "I don't know, Sarah. It looks creepy." Ignoring her friend's apprehension, Sarah snapped a few photos, but as she reviewed them, she noticed something strange. In the background of one shot, a shadowy figure lurked among the trees, its form indistinct and blurred. Sarah's heart raced, but she dismissed it as a trick of the light. "Come on, let's keep going," she urged, eager to explore more of the forest. They continued along the winding paths, but with each step, the atmosphere grew heavier. The whispers of the forest seemed to swirl around them, a soft murmur that made it difficult to concentrate. "What's happening?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Sarah replied, unease creeping into her voice. "Maybe we should turn back." Just then, a rustling noise caught their attention. They turned to see a flash of movement among the trees. "Did you see that?" Mia asked, her eyes wide with fear. "Probably just a deer," Sarah said, though she wasn't convinced. They moved forward cautiously, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of leaves. Suddenly, Sarah felt a strange pull, as if something were beckoning her deeper into the woods. Against her better judgment, she followed the sensation, urging Mia to come along. "It's probably just a cool photo opportunity," she said, attempting to mask her own trepidation. Mia hesitated but finally followed, her unease growing with each step. They soon stumbled upon a narrow, overgrown path that seemed to lead deeper into the heart of the forest. "Should we really go down there?" Mia asked, glancing back toward the main trail. "It's an adventure," Sarah insisted, her curiosity overriding her fear. "We can always come back if it gets too weird." The path wound through the trees, the light growing dimmer as they ventured farther away from the familiar trail. The air turned colder, and the whispers intensified, wrapping around them like an invisible fog. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine, but she pressed on, determined to uncover the secrets of Greywood Forest. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged into another clearing, but this one felt different. The air was thick with an unsettling energy, and the trees loomed ominously around them. In the center of the clearing stood a dilapidated cabin, its windows dark and lifeless, and the door hanging off its hinges. "What do you think happened here?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know, but it looks like no one has lived here for a long time," Sarah replied, her excitement growing despite the foreboding atmosphere. They approached the cabin cautiously, and as Sarah stepped inside, the floor creaked beneath her feet. Dust hung in the air like a shroud, and cobwebs adorned the corners. She pulled out her camera, eager to capture the eerie atmosphere. "Mia, come take a look at this," Sarah called, but her friend remained outside, hesitant to enter. "Are you sure it's safe?" Mia asked, peering through the doorway. "Of course. It's just a cabin," Sarah replied, but even as she spoke, a nagging feeling settled in her stomach. As she explored the dimly lit interior, she found remnants of a life once lived. A broken chair, a tattered blanket, and a small, rusted mirror hanging on the wall. She leaned in to examine her reflection, but as she did, the whispers grew louder, echoing in her mind. "Stay with us, don't leave," they beckoned. Shaking her head, Sarah stepped back, her heart racing. "This place is weird," she muttered to herself, glancing around for Mia. "Sarah," Mia's voice called from outside, tinged with urgency. "We need to go." But before Sarah could respond, She felt a cold breeze sweep through the cabin, extinguishing the last rays of sunlight streaming through the broken windows. The air grew heavy, and the whispers crescendoed into a cacophony of voices. "Join us. Become one with the forest." Panic surged through her as she rushed to the door. "What's happening?" she shouted. But when she stepped outside, Mia was nowhere to be found. "Mia," Sarah called, her voice trembling. She searched the clearing, but the only response was the rustling of leaves in the wind. The whispers surrounded her, echoing from the trees. "Stay, don't leave. Stop it," Sarah yelled, shaking her head to dispel the haunting voices. "Mia," desperation clawed at her chest, and she turned back to the cabin, hoping her friend had simply wandered inside. But as she stepped over the threshold, the air thickened and the shadows deepened. The whispers morphed into a haunting melody, weaving a spell that made it hard to think. "Stay with us, forever." "Where are you?" Sarah cried, panic rising as she raced through the cabin, searching every corner. But there was no sign of Mia. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. "Please, don't do this," Sarah pleaded, her voice echoing in the empty space. The whispers intensified, enveloping her in a cold embrace. "You belong here. You are one of us now." Terror gripped her as she felt the walls of the cabin closing in. She stumbled back outside, her heart pounding. The clearing looked different now, shadows stretching unnaturally, and the trees seemed to sway, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. "Mia!" she screamed. But the only response was the rustle of leaves and the haunting whispers echoing through the woods. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the trees. A girl with long hair and hollow eyes, dressed in a tattered white dress. Sarah's heart dropped as she recognized her. It was the girl from her earlier photos, the shadowy figure lurking in the background. "Join us," the girl whispered, her voice ethereal and haunting. "You can stay with us, forever." "No," Sarah shouted, backing away. "I'm not staying here." But the girl only smiled, a chilling, otherworldly smile that made Sarah's skin crawl. "You cannot escape your fate. The forest will claim you, just as it claimed her." "Where's Mia?" Sarah demanded, desperation flooding her voice. The girl pointed to the trees, and Sarah followed her gaze. In the distance, she saw a flicker of movement, a flash of white disappearing into the underbrush. "Mia!" she shouted, fear coursing through her veins. With renewed determination, Sarah sprinted into the trees, the whispers growing. Tommy, a spirited 13-year-old, had heard the whispers of the forest since he was a child. Unlike the other kids in town, who were terrified of whistling pines, Tommy was drawn to its mystery. With an adventurous heart and a backpack full of snacks, he decided one bright Saturday morning that it was time to explore the forest himself, determined to uncover its secrets and debunk the chilling tales. "Tommy, you can't go into the woods by yourself," his mother called after him, a mix of worry and authority in her voice. "I'll be fine, Mom. I'll stick to the main path and be back before lunch," he shouted back, his confidence unwavering. He waved goodbye and set off, the sun shining brightly above him, casting dappled shadows on the ground. The entrance to Whistling Pines loomed ahead, a dark tunnel of towering trees that seemed to whisper secrets as he passed through. Tommy took a deep breath, the crisp forest air filling his lungs, and stepped onto the narrow trail that wound through the woods. As he walked deeper into the forest, he was captivated by the towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the sky. The leaves whispered above him, creating a melody that was both soothing and eerie. Tommy felt a thrill of excitement, unaware of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface. He spent the next hour exploring, taking pictures with his old camera and marveling at the beauty of the forest. Each snap was a testament to his adventure, a way to prove to his friends back home that he was brave enough to explore the tales of the mysterious Whistling Pines. But as he ventured further along the path, the air grew thick and the light began to dim. Suddenly, he heard it, the whistling. At first, it was soft, like a distant tune carried on the wind, but as it grew louder, it became more sinister. The melody twisted and turned, beckoning him to follow. a seductive call that sent shivers down his spine. "What is that?" he wondered aloud, curiosity getting the better of him. Against his better judgment, Tommy felt a pull towards the sound, a compulsion that made his heart race. He veered off the main path, stepping cautiously into the dense underbrush, his eyes scanning the trees for the source of the haunting whistle. As he pressed on, the world around him grew darker, the light filtering through the leaves becoming scarce. The whistling turned melodic, echoing through the trees, wrapping around him like a fog. "Hello?" he called out, but his voice felt small and insignificant against the chorus of whispers. The whistling grew louder, wrapping around him, pulling him deeper into the woods. Tommy felt a thrill of fear, but was too curious to turn back. He pressed on, guided by the enchanting sound. As he ventured deeper, he stumbled into a small clearing. At its center stood an ancient stone well, its edges overgrown with moss and ivy. The whistling seemed to emanate from the well, a haunting melody that reverberated in his chest. He approached cautiously, peering over the edge into the darkness below. "Maybe I can find out what's down there," he mused, a mix of bravery and foolishness igniting his sense of adventure. Leaning in closer, he felt a rush of cold air rise from the well, swirling around him like a ghostly embrace. The whistling grew louder, morphing into a chorus of voices that seemed to beckon him closer. Join us, they whispered, luring him in. "Stop it, this isn't funny," Tommy shouted into the well, his voice echoing back at him. He took a step back, feeling a wave of panic wash over him. "I should go back," he thought, his instinct screaming that he had gone too far. But as he turned to leave, a sudden chill swept through the clearing. The temperature dropped and the shadows deepened, swallowing the last rays of sunlight. The air thickened, and the whispers escalated into frantic pleas. "Stay with us. Join us." Heart racing, Tommy turned to run, but as he did, the world around him began to shift. The trees seemed to twist and bend, their branches reaching out like claws. The path he had come from vanished, replaced by a labyrinth of dark shadows and tangled roots. The whistling morphed into a cacophony of laughter, echoing through the trees. "Help! Someone help me!" he screamed, his voice trembling as he ran deeper into the woods, desperation fueling his flight. He stumbled through the underbrush, branches clawing at his clothes, the whispers growing louder, drowning out his thoughts. "You cannot escape, you belong to us." Tears streamed down his face as he sprinted through the forest, but every direction looked the same. The shadows loomed larger, and the laughter echoed in his ears, a haunting melody that filled him with dread. Just when he thought he would be lost forever, he spotted a flicker of light in the distance. "Please, let it be a way out," he thought, his heart pounding as he raced toward the light. As he approached, he realized it was a small campfire flickering in the darkness, surrounded by a circle of rocks. "Hello," he called, hope surging in his chest. "Is anyone there?" But as he neared the fire, he saw no one was present. The light danced eerily, casting strange shadows on the trees around him. The warmth of the fire was inviting, but Tommy felt a deep sense of unease settle in his stomach. Suddenly, he heard the whispers again, swirling around him like a storm. "Join us. Become one with the forest," they called, growing louder, more insistent. He turned to flee, but the shadows seemed to shift and swirl, blocking his path. "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice breaking. Just then, a figure stepped out from the shadows, a girl, perhaps a few years older than him, with wild hair and eyes that glowed in the firelight. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice a mix of concern and resignation. "They will take you if you stay." "Who will take me?" Tommy asked, panic rising in his throat. "The whispers," she replied, her gaze darting toward the trees. "They lure you in, and once they have you, you can never leave. I thought I could resist, but I'm still here, trapped." Tommy's heart raced as the whispers crescendoed, a chorus of voices demanding his attention. "You don't understand. You need to get out of here." "I can't," she said, tears brimming in her eyes. "I tried to escape, but they pulled me back. They want us to stay." Forever? A cold dread settled in Tommy's chest as the shadows around them thickened, encroaching on their small circle of light. "No!" he shouted, turning to run. But the darkness enveloped him, swallowing him whole. The forest seemed to close in around him, and he felt the whispers pulling at him, urging him to join them. "You belong here," they cried, wrapping around him like a shroud. "Stay with us." Tommy fought against the invisible force, desperately searching for a way out. "Please, let me go," he screamed. But the darkness only deepened, blurring his vision and twisting his senses. In a last-ditch effort, he closed his eyes and concentrated on the path he had taken, the warmth of the sun on his skin, the sound of laughter with his friends. With a surge of determination, he forced himself to move, pushing against the shadows that clung to him like a heavy fog. As he stumbled forward, the whispers grew frantic, swirling around him in a frenzy. "You can't leave. You're ours," they screamed. But Tommy refused to listen. He charged forward, pushing through the darkness until he broke free into the clearing. Gasping for breath, he found himself back at the ancient well, the shadows dissipating as the sunlight broke through the trees. The whispers faded to a soft murmur, and he felt a sense of relief wash over him. But the girl's haunting eyes remained etched in his mind. "Tommy!" a voice called out, and he turned to see Mia rushing toward him, her face filled with worry. "I was so scared. I thought I lost you." "I thought I lost you too," Tommy replied, his voice trembling. "We need to get out of here." Together, they sprinted back toward the path, the shadows receding behind them. The forest seemed to sigh, as if releasing its hold on them. As they emerged from the woods, the bright sunlight washed over them, and Tommy felt the weight of the forest lift from his shoulders. But as they reached the edge of whistling pines, Tommy glanced back, the echoes of the whispers lingering in his mind. He could still feel the pull of the forest, the haunting call that beckoned to him. And deep down, he knew that while he had escaped this time, the shadows of whistling pines would always remain, waiting. One cool autumn evening, a group of friends gathered around a fire in the backyard of an old, weathered cabin on the outskirts of town. Among them was Lily, a spirited girl of 16 with a reputation for being brave, perhaps even reckless. She leaned in closer to the fire, her face illuminated by the flickering flames, as she shared stories of the grove with her friends, Peter, Jane, and Mark. "Did you know that over the years, countless people have gone missing in Eldridge Grove?" she said, her voice low and conspiratorial. "Some say they can still hear their cries in the wind. It's like they're trapped in the forest, forever trying to find their way home." "Yeah, right," scoffed Mark, tossing a twig into the fire. "Those are just stories to scare kids. There's nothing out there but trees." Jane, who had been nervously glancing toward the forest, spoke up. "But what if they're true? What if something really is out there?" "Come on, don't tell me you believe that nonsense," Mark said, rolling his eyes. "I bet if we went out there, we'd find nothing but more stories." Lily's eyes sparkled with mischief as she contemplated the idea. "Why don't we go explore the grove tonight? It'll be fun. We can prove Mark wrong." Peter, usually the most cautious of the group, hesitated. "I don't know, guys. It's getting late, and we don't want to get lost. Relax. We'll stick together and just follow the main path," Lily reassured him, her adventurous spirit infectious. After a bit of banter and persuasion, the group decided to embark on their nighttime adventure into Eldridge Grove, armed with flashlights, snacks, and an eagerness to conquer their fears. The excitement buzzed in the air as they made their way toward the forest, the darkness thickening around them like a heavy blanket. Once they reached the edge of Eldridge Grove, the atmosphere shifted. The trees loomed tall and imposing, their branches clawing at the night sky. A dense fog rolled in, curling around their ankles and swallowing the path ahead. Lily shone her flashlight into the gloom, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. "See? It's not so scary," she declared, leading the way down the narrow path. Mark, Jane, and Peter followed closely, their footsteps echoing against the stillness of the night. As they ventured deeper, the forest transformed. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. The shadows danced around them, and an eerie quiet enveloped the grove, amplifying their whispers and laughter. "Hey, do you hear that?" Jane said, her voice trembling as she paused. "Hear what?" Mark scoffed, but he fell silent, listening intently. It was faint, a soft, mournful cry that drifted through the trees like a wisp of smoke. "It's probably just the wind," Lily said, attempting to mask her own unease. But as they walked further in, the sound grew clearer. A child's voice calling out, "Help me! Please help me!" "Is someone out there?" Peter shouted, glancing around nervously. The forest remained silent, but the cries continued, weaving in and out of the trees, beckoning them to follow. "Should we check it out?" Jane asked, her face pale. Lily hesitated, torn between her curiosity and the fear that gripped her. "It might be someone lost," she said, gripping her flashlight tightly. "We can't just leave them." Against their better judgment, the group pressed on, following the haunting cries deeper into the heart of the forest. The atmosphere grew thicker, the air heavy with an unexplainable tension. The trees closed in around them, the shadows stretching longer and deeper, cloaking their surroundings in darkness. "Guys, I really don't like this," Mark said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "What if it's a trap?" "Stop being such a baby," Lily snapped, though her heart raced in her chest. As they continued, the cries transformed into eerie laughter, echoing off the trees like a twisted melody. It was disorienting, a cacophony that played tricks on their minds. Each footstep felt heavier, the forest seeming to come alive around them. Suddenly, Peter stopped dead in his tracks, his face ashen. "Did you see that?" he whispered, pointing into the darkness. "What? What did you see?" Jane asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Over there," Peter said, his eyes wide with fear. There was someone, moving between the trees. The group fell silent, their hearts pounding as they strained to see into the shadows. Just then, a figure emerged from the darkness, a small girl dressed in a tattered white dress, her hair disheveled and wild. "Help me!" she cried, her voice filled with desperation. "Please, you have to help me." Lily's heart raced with a mix of compassion and fear. "What's wrong? Where are your parents?" The girl looked up at them, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know. I can't find them. I've been lost for so long." "Let's get her out of here," Mark said, his voice shaking. But as they moved closer, the girl took a step back, her expression changing from fear to something darker. "You can't help me," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're already lost." "What do you mean?" Lily asked, confusion and dread creeping in. Suddenly, the forest erupted into chaos. The shadows swirled around them, thickening like a fog, obscuring their vision. The girl's face twisted into a sinister grin as the laughter of children echoed through the trees, a sound both haunting and joyful. "Join us. Join the lost ones," she sang, her voice rising above the chaos. "Run," Peter shouted, and the group turned to flee. But the path had vanished, replaced by a maze of trees that seemed to shift and change, trapping them in a web of darkness. "Stay together," Lily yelled, panic surging through her as they stumbled through the trees. The laughter followed them, growing louder and more frantic, a relentless reminder that they were not alone. As they ran, the whispers intensified, wrapping around them like a cold embrace. "You belong to us forever," they sang, the voices echoing in their minds. "Over here," Jane cried, spotting a faint glow through the trees. They sprinted toward the light, desperate to escape the suffocating darkness. But as they drew closer, it flickered and faded, leaving them in the thick fog once more. "Why isn't it getting any brighter?" Mark panted, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Keep moving," Lily urged, her heart racing as they pressed on. But the shadows pressed in around them, and every direction looked the same. Suddenly, they heard it again, the cries. "Help me! Please help me!" The voice echoed through the trees, pulling them in different directions. "No," Lily shouted, struggling against the compulsion to follow the sound. "We can't listen to it." "Why not?" Mark yelled, his eyes wild with fear. "What if it's real?" "Because it's a trick," Lily insisted, desperation creeping into her voice. "They want to lure us in." But the shadows were relentless, tugging at them like ghostly fingers. One by one, her friends began to drift away, pulled by the siren call of the cries. "Help me," they echoed, pulling at their hearts, and the forest seemed to laugh, mocking their plight. "No, don't go," Lily screamed, tears streaming down her face as she watched Mark disappear into the darkness, his silhouette swallowed by the trees. "Peter, Jane," she cried, but their voices were drowned out by the laughter of the forest, the whispers taunting her as she stumbled backward, fear gripping her heart. "Join us," the voices called, growing louder and more insistent. Lily felt her resolve falter as the shadows closed in around her, the darkness wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. She turned to run, her legs carrying her deeper into the forest, but the whispers followed her, echoing in her mind. "Join the lost ones. You can't escape." Panic surged through her as she raced through the trees, desperate to find a way out. But every direction she turned seemed to lead her deeper into the grove, the shadows stretching and twisting, obscuring the path. Just when she thought all hope was lost, she spotted a flicker of light in the distance, a glow that pierced through the darkness. With every ounce of strength, she sprinted toward it, her heart pounding in her chest. As she broke through the trees, she found herself back at the edge of the forest, the bright moon illuminating the path before her. Gasping for breath, she turned to look back at Eldridge Grove. One chilly autumn evening, a group of 4 friends, Sarah, Josh, Emma, and Mike, sat around a crackling bonfire in Sarah's backyard. The flames danced and flickered, casting an orange glow on their faces, while the night air grew crisp and cool. They had gathered to celebrate the end of summer, but as the sun set, the stories turned to the haunting tales of Echo Hollow. "Did you hear about that guy last month?" Josh asked, poking the fire with a stick. "He went hiking and just vanished. No one knows what happened to him." "Yeah, and remember the couple who went missing 2 years ago?" Emma chimed in, her voice slightly shaky. "They said they could hear someone calling for help, but when they went to check it out, they just disappeared." "It's just a bunch of stories," Mike scoffed, dismissing their fears. "People get lost all the time. It doesn't mean there's anything supernatural going on." Sarah, who had always been curious about the tales, leaned forward, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Why don't we go explore Echo Hollow tonight? Just a little way in. We can prove Mike wrong." "Are you crazy?" Emma exclaimed, glancing nervously toward the trees. "What if we get lost?" "We'll be fine," Sarah insisted, her adventurous spirit shining through. "We'll just follow the path, and if it gets too scary, we'll come back." Josh and Mike exchanged glances, and after a moment of hesitation, Josh shrugged. "I'm in. It could be fun." "Fine, but let's not go too far," Emma said, her apprehension evident as they gathered their flashlights and backpacks. With laughter and excitement in the air, the group made their way toward the edge of Echo Hollow. The forest loomed before them, an intimidating wall of darkness. The sounds of the night, crickets chirping and owls hooting, filled the air as they stepped onto the narrow, winding path. As they walked deeper into the woods, the atmosphere shifted. The trees loomed larger, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The moonlight filtered through the leaves, casting eerie shadows that danced around them. "Okay, this is kind of creepy," Emma admitted, glancing back at the path they had come from. "Don't be such a wuss," Mike teased, but his voice lacked conviction. They pressed on, laughter echoing against the quiet. As they ventured further into Echo Hollow, they began to notice strange things. The air grew colder, and a thick fog rolled in, curling around their legs like a living entity. The trees whispered, the wind carrying faint, ghostly sounds that made the hair on the back of their necks stand on end. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her heart racing as she turned to look behind her. "It's probably just the wind," Josh said, trying to sound brave. but the uncertainty crept into his voice. As they moved further along the path, the whispers grew louder, melding with the rustling of leaves. "Help me! Please help me!" a voice called, distant yet close enough to make their skin crawl. "Is someone out there?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's a trick," Mike said, attempting to sound dismissive but failing to hide his unease. "Let's check it out," Sarah suggested, her curiosity piqued. "What if someone really needs help?" The group hesitated but eventually nodded in agreement, drawn toward the eerie call. They followed the sound, their flashlights piercing the darkness as they ventured deeper into the forest. As they walked, the trees seemed to close in around them, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The path began to twist and turn, leading them deeper into the heart of Echo Hollow. The cries continued, growing louder, a haunting plea that echoed through the trees. "Help us! Please help us!" the voice pleaded, and a chill ran down Sarah's spine. "Maybe we should turn back," Emma suggested, her voice trembling. But before anyone could respond, they stumbled into a small clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated cabin, its windows dark and empty. The door hung ajar, creaking softly in the wind. The cries seemed to emanate from within, pulling them closer. "Should we go in?" Josh asked, his eyes darting nervously around the clearing. "Someone might be trapped," Sarah insisted, her curiosity overpowering her fear. "We have to check it out." With trepidation, they approached the cabin. The air grew thick with a sense of foreboding as they stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking beneath their feet. The darkness enveloped them, and the whispers grew louder, swirling around them like a storm. "Help us! We're lost!" The voices echoed, rising and falling in a haunting melody. "Where are you?" Mike shouted, panic seeping into his voice. "What do you want from us?" Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and the cabin seemed to come alive. Shadows flickered in the corners of their vision, and the air crackled with an energy that made their skin prickle. "Get out!" a voice shouted from the shadows, and the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. "Let us out!" Emma screamed, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers turned frantic, the voices swirling around them, tugging at their minds. "Join us! Join the lost ones!" they chanted, their tones both mournful and inviting. "Stop it! This isn't funny!" Josh yelled, panic rising in his throat as he turned to face the darkness. But as they looked around, they realized they were no longer alone. Figures began to materialize from the shadows, ghostly apparitions with hollow eyes, their faces twisted in eternal despair. They reached out toward the group, their fingers trembling with longing. "Help us!" one figure whispered, its voice laced with sorrow. "We've been waiting for so long." "No," Sarah shouted, her heart racing as she backed away. "We have to find a way out." But the spirits only drew closer, their mournful expressions tugging at her heart. "You can join us, you can be free," they coaxed, their voices merging into a haunting lullaby. "Don't listen to them," Mike cried, his voice shaky as he pressed against the wall, desperate to find an escape. Suddenly, the floorboards beneath them groaned, and the cabin began to shake. The walls closed in, and the spirits surged forward, their whispers drowning out the sound of their racing hearts. "You belong here with us, forever. Run!" Sarah shouted, seizing Mike's hand and dragging him toward the back of the cabin. The others followed, fear propelling them forward as they searched for an exit. The shadows writhed around them, reaching out with cold, ghostly fingers. They burst through a back door into the night, tumbling out into the clearing. But the forest had transformed. The path they had taken had vanished, replaced by a labyrinth of twisted trees and shadows. "Where do we go?" Josh panted, looking around frantically. "Follow me," Sarah yelled, darting toward what she hoped was a way out. The whispers followed them, taunting and beckoning. "You can't escape. You're ours now," they sang, their voices rising in a sinister crescendo. As they ran, the darkness enveloped them, the trees closing in like a prison. The ground beneath their feet shifted, and branches reached out to snag at their clothes. The shadows loomed larger, swallowing the moonlight and plunging them into a suffocating darkness. "Stay together," Mike shouted, but the panic was palpable. They could barely see one another, the air heavy with despair. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, they spotted a flicker of light in the distance, an ethereal glow that beckoned them forward. "Over there," Emma shouted, pointing toward the light. With renewed determination, they sprinted toward it, the whispers fading into a distant echo. As they reached the edge of the clearing, they stumbled into a grove of trees bathed in silvery moonlight. The atmosphere shifted, and the air felt lighter, free of the oppressive darkness they had just escaped. "We made it," Sarah exclaimed, gasping for breath as they stood at the edge of the forest, the shadows retreating behind them. But as they turned to look back, they could still hear the whispers, softer now but laced with anger. "You can't escape us. We will find you." Shaken but relieved, they made their way back to town, the haunted echoes of Echo Hollow still ringing in their ears. Each of them silently vowed never to return, the forest's mysteries forever locked behind the veil of darkness. Yet, as they reached the safety of their homes, each of them felt the weight of a lingering presence, a shadow that had followed them back from the depths of Echo Hollow. And in their dreams that night, they heard it again. One summer evening, a group of 5 friends, Megan, Tyler, Lily, Jake, and Anna, decided to explore Blackwood Forest, intrigued by the legends and the promise of adventure. They had heard the stories, of course. People who had ventured too deep and lost their way, only to be heard from again in dreams or echoes, warning others not to follow. But the allure of the unknown was too strong for their youthful hearts, and they packed their bags with flashlights, snacks, and a sense of invincibility. As dusk fell, they drove to the edge of the forest, the sun sinking behind the treetops, casting long shadows that danced across the ground. Megan, the most adventurous of the group, hopped out of the car first, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Come on, guys. Let's see what all the fuss is about." "Just remember to stick together," Anna cautioned, adjusting her backpack nervously. "I don't want to get lost." Tyler rolled his eyes but nodded. "We'll be fine. It's just a forest, right?" They set off down the main path, the chirping of crickets filling the air. As they ventured deeper, the trees closed in around them, blocking out the last remnants of daylight. The air grew cooler, and an eerie silence settled, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. "It's kind of creepy in here," Jake admitted, glancing around as shadows flickered in the corners of his vision. "Oh, come on. You guys are such babies," Megan laughed, swinging her flashlight around playfully. "What's the worst that could happen?" But as they continued down the winding trail, the atmosphere changed. The trees seemed to whisper secrets to one another, and the wind carried a strange chill that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. Megan, still leading the way, stopped suddenly. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her tone shifting from playful to serious. "Hear what?" Tyler asked, his voice slightly shaky. "It sounded like someone calling," Megan replied, tilting her head to listen. "Probably just the wind," Lily said, though her voice lacked conviction. But then, clear as day, they all heard it, a faint, distant voice calling out, "Help me! Please help me!" The friends exchanged worried glances, unease creeping into their hearts. "Should we check it out?" Anna suggested hesitantly, glancing back toward the path they had come from. "Maybe we should turn back," Jake said, his earlier bravado evaporating. "No, we can't just ignore it," Megan insisted, her adventurous spirit flaring again. "What if someone really needs help?" With a mix of fear and curiosity, they pressed on, the voice growing louder as they approached a small clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its windows dark and uninviting. The door creaked ominously on its hinges, and the voice seemed to come from within. "Hello?" Megan called, stepping forward. "Is anyone in there?" The voice grew frantic. "Help me. Please. I'm trapped." Without thinking, Megan pushed the door open, stepping into the cabin. The air inside was stale and thick with dust, and shadows clung to the corners. As her friends hesitated at the threshold, The door swung shut behind her with a loud bang, plunging them into darkness. "Guys," Megan called, her voice trembling as she turned around. The cabin was empty, the only sound her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. "Guys, this isn't funny." "Megan," Tyler shouted, panic rising in his voice. "Open the door." But when Megan tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. "It's stuck," she yelled, fear gripping her heart. Suddenly, the whispers returned, swirling around her like a cold mist. "Help us! Help us!" The voices echoed, a chorus of sorrow that tugged at her heart. Shadows shifted and danced in the dim light, and the air grew heavier, pressing against her chest. "Megan, let us in," Jake shouted, banging on the door. "Help us! Join us!" The voices urged, their tones soothing yet chilling. Megan stumbled backward, her flashlight flickering as the shadows encroached. "No, get away from me," she cried, backing toward the far wall. "Megan!" Anna's voice came from the other side, desperate and fearful. "Megan, just hold on. We'll find a way to get you out," Tyler shouted, his voice echoing with panic. But the whispers grew louder, drowning out their cries. "Join us, forever," they sang, and Megan felt an overwhelming sense of despair wash over her. Suddenly, the door flew open, and her friends rushed inside, their faces pale with fear. "Megan, we thought we lost you," Lily exclaimed, wrapping her arms around her. "I was stuck," Megan gasped, her heart racing. "But we have to go. Something's not right here." The shadows writhed, and the whispers grew frantic. "Leave now. You cannot stay," they pleaded, echoing around them. "Come on, let's get out of here," Jake urged, and they rushed back through the door. But as they stepped outside, they found the clearing had transformed. The path they had taken had vanished, replaced by a maze of twisted trees and thick fog. "What the hell?" Tyler shouted, panic rising in his voice. "Megan, what did you do?" Anna asked, her voice shaking. "I didn't do anything. It just happened," Megan replied, her heart pounding as they glanced around, disoriented. "We need to find a way back," Lily insisted, but every direction looked the same, shadows closing in around them like a suffocating embrace. As they moved deeper into the trees, the whispers followed, growing louder, drowning out their thoughts. "You cannot escape, you belong to us." "Megan, do you hear that?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. "Of course I hear it. It's the same voice," Megan cried, her fear palpable. "Wait, what if we just follow the voices?" Tyler suggested, desperation creeping into his tone. "Maybe they'll lead us out." "No, we can't trust them," Anna shouted, shaking her head vigorously. "They'll only lead us deeper into the forest." But the whispers called to them, promising safety and freedom. "Help us, we need you." Against their better judgment, the group began to follow the voices, their hearts racing as they ventured deeper into the woods. The air grew thick with an unnatural fog that clung to their skin, and the trees seemed to close in, obscuring the moonlight. As they walked, the voices grew more insistent, swirling around them like a tempest. "Join us! Join the lost ones," they chanted, their tones echoing with a haunting melody. "Megan, this is your fault," Jake snapped, anger and fear mixing in his voice. "Shut up. This isn't helping," she shouted back, feeling the weight of their despair. Suddenly, they stumbled into another clearing, and before them stood an ancient stone altar, covered in moss and surrounded by flickering candles. The air buzzed with a strange energy, and shadows danced around the edges of the clearing. "Help us!" the voices cried, echoing from the altar. "Join us in eternal rest." "Guys, I don't like this," Anna said, her voice trembling as she backed away from the altar. "Let's just go around it," Lily suggested. But before they could move, the shadows coalesced into a swirling mist, blocking their path. "Join us," the voices begged, growing louder and more desperate. "You cannot escape your fate." Panic surged through the group as they realized they were trapped, surrounded by darkness. The whispers grew frantic, echoing in their minds, drowning out all rational thought. Run! Megan screamed, and they turned to flee, but the shadows twisted and shifted, leading them in circles. Every turn they took seemed to bring them back to the altar, a sinister beacon in the darkness. Megan, do something, Tyler shouted, desperation in his voice. I don't know what to do, she cried, tears streaming down her face as the voices pressed in around them. Just keep running. As they raced through the trees, the whispers grew louder, pulling at their minds. You belong to us. Join the lost ones. Suddenly, Megan spotted a faint light flickering in the distance, a glimmer of hope amid the suffocating darkness. Over there, she shouted, and they all sprinted toward it, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they reached the edge of the clearing, they burst into another grove, the moonlight shining bright once more. The shadows receded, and the oppressive weight lifted slightly, allowing them to breathe. We did it, Jake gasped, his chest heaving with exertion. But as they turned to look back at the forest, they heard it again, the cries. Help us! Please help us! The voices echoed, growing fainter as they retreated. We have to go back. One evening, a group of adventurous teenagers, Ben, Chloe, Sam, and Rachel, decided to challenge the legends of Hollow Creek. Eager to prove their bravery, they gathered their flashlights, snacks, and courage, intent on exploring the forest as the sun began to set. Ben, the unofficial leader of the group, was determined to uncover the truth behind the mysterious tales that had kept the town on edge for so long. Come on, it'll be fun, he urged as they parked near the forest's edge, a thin layer of fog clinging to the ground. What's the worst that could happen? How about getting lost or running into whatever took those people? Chloe replied, trying to mask her fear with sarcasm. Or maybe we'll find out they were just myths, Sam chimed in, his voice a mix of excitement and apprehension. I mean, how many people really disappear in the woods? Rachel, who had lived in Everwood her whole life, shivered as she looked at the darkening trees. My grandma used to tell me stories about the forest, she said quietly. She always warned me to stay away. It's not just the missing people. It's the whispers. What whispers? Ben asked, a teasing smile on his face. You mean the ones you hear when the wind blows? Yeah, those, Rachel replied, her voice steadying. But they aren't just wind. They sound like voices, calling for help. Come on, you're scaring us. Chloe laughed, but her tone was nervous. The shadows of the trees seemed to reach out toward them, and a chill crept into the air as they entered the forest. As they stepped onto the winding path, the sun dipped below the horizon, and darkness enveloped them. The towering trees blocked out the fading light, creating an almost claustrophobic atmosphere. The sounds of the forest came alive, leaves rustling, branches creaking, and distant animal calls echoing in the night. Let's just stick together, Ben said, trying to maintain the group's morale. We'll be fine. If we see anything weird, we just turn back. They ventured deeper into Hollow Creek, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The deeper they went, the more the sounds of the forest shifted. A heavy silence replaced the usual nighttime symphony, pressing in around them like a thick fog. I don't like this, Chloe said, glancing back toward the way they had come. It feels wrong. Relax, it's just a forest, Ben said, though he too felt the weight of the oppressive silence. We'll find a clearing and take some pictures for proof. After walking for what felt like hours, they finally stumbled into a small clearing, a serene patch of moonlight illuminating the ground. They caught their breath, the tension in the air easing slightly. This isn't so bad, Sam said, looking up at the stars peeking through the treetops. Yeah, let's take a picture, Rachel suggested, pulling out her phone. As she snapped a photo, the flash momentarily blinded them. When their vision cleared, they noticed something strange, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden in the shadows. Did you see that? Ben asked, squinting into the darkness. See what? Chloe replied, her heart racing. There was someone over there, he insisted, pointing toward the figure. Maybe it's just a trick of the light, Rachel said, trying to dismiss the fear creeping into her mind. But as they looked again, the figure was gone. Let's not stick around, Chloe urged, her earlier bravado fading. We should head back. Reluctantly, the group turned to retrace their steps, but as they moved deeper into the forest, the path began to twist and turn unexpectedly. The trees seemed to shift around them, creating a maze that left them feeling disoriented. "Wait, this isn't right," Ben said, frowning as he checked his phone for service. "I can't get a signal. We need to find our way back." "What do you mean you can't get a signal?" Sam asked, panic creeping into his voice. "We can't be that far from the edge." "Maybe we should just keep walking," Rachel suggested, her heart racing. "We'll find our way eventually." But as they continued, the air grew colder, and the oppressive silence returned, thickening like a blanket around them. They stumbled upon another clearing, but this one felt different, darker and more foreboding. "Guys, I really don't like this," Chloe whispered, her eyes darting around as if expecting something to leap from the shadows. Before anyone could respond, the whispers began. Soft at first, then growing louder, echoing through the trees. "Help us! Please help us!" the voices called, merging into a haunting melody that sent chills down their spines. "Where is that coming from?" Sam asked, his eyes wide with fear. "Maybe we should follow it," Ben suggested, but his voice trembled. "Maybe someone really needs help." "No. Are you crazy?" Chloe shouted, panic surging through her. "We should get out of here." But the whispers were intoxicating, pulling at their hearts and minds, promising safety and understanding. Against their better judgment, they started toward the source of the sound, the darkness closing in around them. As they walked deeper into the woods, the voices intensified, swirling around them like a living entity. "Join us! Join the lost ones," they sang, their tones sweet yet sinister. "Turn back!" Rachel yelled, suddenly terrified. "We can't trust them." But the words seemed to echo uselessly, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. The trees around them shifted, and the shadows grew longer, reaching out like claws. "Megan!" A voice called from the shadows, and Rachel froze. The voice sounded so familiar, a sweet whisper that sent shivers down her spine. "Help us! We're trapped." "Megan?" Rachel breathed, recognizing the name. It belonged to her sister, who had disappeared in the forest years ago, a victim of the very tales they were now living. "Rachel, help us!" the voice cried, and Rachel's heart ached with the longing she felt. "You can save us." "No," Chloe screamed, grabbing Rachel's arm. "Don't listen. It's a trap." But the allure of her sister's voice was too strong. Rachel felt herself drawn toward the darkness, her heart pounding in her chest as she stepped forward. "I have to help her," she cried, breaking free from Chloe's grip. "No, Rachel, don't," Ben shouted, but it was too late. Rachel disappeared into the shadows, her figure swallowed by the darkness. "Rachel!" the others yelled, but the forest erupted into chaos. The whispers grew louder, drowning out their cries. "Join us, forever." Panic surged through Ben, Chloe, and Sam as they turned to flee. But the path they had followed had vanished, replaced by an endless expanse of trees and darkness. "We have to find her," Ben shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "Where do we even start?" Chloe cried, tears streaming down her face. "Look for the clearing," Sam yelled, desperation fueling him. "We have to retrace our steps." But as they ran, the whispers grew more insistent, echoing in their minds. "You cannot escape, you belong to us." "Stop, stop," Ben shouted, pressing his hands against his ears. "We have to focus." But the darkness pressed in around them, suffocating and oppressive. They stumbled through the trees, disoriented and terrified, as the forest seemed to come alive, shadows dancing in their periphery. "We're never getting out of here," Chloe sobbed, her fear spiraling out of control. Suddenly, a flash of light illuminated the area, a sudden burst of brightness that momentarily dispelled the darkness. They turned to see Rachel standing there, her expression vacant, eyes wide and unseeing. "Rachel!" Ben yelled, rushing toward her, but the light flickered and faded. Rachel's figure wavered like a mirage before disappearing completely. "No, Rachel!" Chloe screamed, reaching out into the darkness. But the darkness swallowed her cries, the whispers rising in a cacophony of despair. "Join us. You cannot escape. You are lost." The friends pressed on, desperate to find their way back. But as they ran, the shadows twisted and turned, leading them in circles, each step pulling them deeper into the heart of Hollow Creek. Finally, they stumbled into another clearing, gasping for breath. But this time, the air felt charged, alive with a dark energy. The trees loomed ominously, casting grotesque shadows on the ground. "Where are we?" Sam asked, panting heavily as he looked around. "I don't know," Ben admitted, glancing nervously at the encroaching darkness. "But we can't stay here." As they turned to leave, the whispers returned, louder than ever, echoing in their minds. "Join us forever." Suddenly, figures began to. For years, the tales of the Whispering Pines had circulated around Crestwood. Legends spoke of shadows lurking in the trees and a mysterious trail that would appear only to those who were lost. Many claimed to have seen ghostly figures flitting through the branches, beckoning to wanderers. It was said that those who followed the trail never returned, swallowed by the forest itself. Despite the warnings, a group of friends, Liam, Sarah, Mark, and Jessica, decided to hike through the Whispering Pines one Saturday afternoon. They were well aware of the stories, but felt confident in their ability to navigate the forest with their maps and compasses. Their plan was to hike to a secluded lake rumored to be hidden deep within the woods, a perfect spot for a picnic and some fun. "Come on, it'll be an adventure," Liam said, his excitement infectious as they piled into the car. "Just think of the stories we'll tell afterward." "I'd rather not add to the ghost stories," Jessica replied, glancing uneasily at the towering trees as they parked near the trailhead. "What if we get lost?" "Relax, Jess. We have everything we need," Mark reassured her, unfurling the map. "We'll just stick to the trail. It'll be fine." With that, they set off, the sun shining brightly overhead. The path meandered through towering pines, and the air was filled with the scent of earth and pine needles. As they walked, they laughed and shared stories, pushing aside the unsettling rumors that loomed over the forest. After an hour of hiking, the trees began to grow thicker, and the atmosphere shifted. The sunlight filtered through the branches in a way that felt both beautiful and foreboding. As they continued, they stumbled upon an intersection in the trail. "Wait, I don't remember seeing this on the map," Sarah said, her brow furrowing as she examined the fork ahead. "Maybe it's a shortcut?" Liam suggested, glancing down both paths. The left trail seemed narrower and more overgrown, while the right path appeared well-trodden. "I say we take the right. Are you sure?" Jessica hesitated. "What if it leads us away from the lake?" "It's the better path," Liam insisted, and after a brief discussion, they decided to follow his lead. As they walked further down the right trail, the mood shifted again. The cheerful chatter faded, replaced by an unsettling silence. Even the birds had gone quiet, as if the forest was holding its breath. "Does anyone else feel weird?" Mark asked, glancing around. "It's too quiet." "Yeah, it feels off," Sarah agreed, shivering despite the warmth of the day. "Come on, don't be such scaredy cats. It's just a forest." Liam laughed, but even he felt a hint of unease creeping in. After what felt like another hour of walking, they finally arrived at a small clearing with a shimmering lake in the center. It was beautiful, the water reflecting the surrounding trees like glass. "See? I told you it would be worth it," Liam exclaimed, spreading out a blanket for their picnic. They settled down and enjoyed their lunch, but the nagging feeling of unease didn't fade. As they ate, Jessica kept glancing back toward the path, as if expecting someone to appear from the trees. "Hey, why don't we take some pictures?" Mark suggested, pulling out his phone. "Let's capture this moment." They gathered together at the edge of the water, posing with smiles that masked their growing discomfort. As Mark snapped the first picture, a sudden breeze swept through the clearing, sending ripples across the water. In the distance, the trees swayed ominously, but they brushed it off, laughing as Mark continued to take photos. "All right, one more," he said, adjusting the camera for a group shot. Just as he was about to click, a shadow darted through the trees behind them. Mark's finger hovered over the button. "Did you see that?" he asked, eyes wide. "See what?" Liam turned, squinting into the shadows. "I swear I just saw someone over there." Mark pointed, his excitement turning to anxiety. "Maybe it's just a deer or something," Sarah suggested, though she felt a chill run down her spine. "Let's check it out," Liam urged, his adventurous spirit overriding their apprehension. With a mix of reluctance and curiosity, they followed Liam toward the edge of the woods where Mark had seen the shadow. The trees loomed above them, and the sunlight barely penetrated the dense canopy, casting the area in a dim, eerie light. "Stay close, okay?" Jessica whispered, gripping Sarah's arm as they ventured into the shadows. As they moved deeper, the underbrush rustled, and the whispers returned, barely audible but distinctly there. Soft voices calling from somewhere within the trees. "Help us, please help us." "Did you hear that?" Jessica asked, her heart racing. "Yeah, it's coming from over there," Liam said, straining to listen. The whispers grew louder, pulling them in like a siren's call. "We shouldn't be here," Sarah insisted, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But Liam pushed on, more intrigued than afraid. "Just a little further. We have to see what it is." Mark hesitated but eventually followed, curiosity overpowering his fear. As they pressed deeper into the woods, the path began to narrow, and the trees closed in around them, blocking out the light. Suddenly, the whispers intensified, becoming a chaotic symphony of voices pleading for help. "Help us! You must help us!" "Guys, this isn't right," Sarah said, backing away. "We need to go back now." But Liam pressed on, his eyes wide with fascination. "Just a bit further. We can't turn back now." The shadows seemed to writhe around them, and the air grew thick with dread. "You're almost there. Join us," the voices urged, echoing in their minds. "Liam, stop!" Jessica yelled, grabbing his arm. "We have to leave." But it was too late. The shadows erupted around them, twisting and coiling like smoke. The friends found themselves disoriented, unable to tell which way they had come. The once familiar path had vanished, replaced by a labyrinth of darkness. "Where are we?" Mark panicked, glancing wildly around. "This isn't funny." "Keep moving," Liam shouted, his bravado slipping as they stumbled through the thickening darkness. The whispers surrounded them, echoing like a haunting lullaby. "You are lost. You are one of us now. We can't let it take us," Sarah cried, tears streaming down her face as she grabbed Jessica's hand. "We have to stick together." But as they ran, the shadows twisted, blocking their path at every turn. "Help us! You can't escape," the voices taunted, growing louder and more insistent. "We need to find the lake," Mark shouted, desperation filling his voice. "That's the only way we can get out of here." They pushed on, adrenaline fueling their legs as they navigated the ever-changing maze. The darkness pressed in, and the whispers became a cacophony, drowning out their thoughts. Suddenly, they stumbled back into the clearing where they had started, the lake glimmering eerily under the moonlight. But something was different. The air felt charged, as if the very forest was alive, watching them with malicious intent. "Where's Liam?" Jessica gasped, her heart sinking as she realized their friend was missing. "He was right behind us," Sarah shouted, panic rising in her voice. "Liam," Mark called, but his voice echoed emptily, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The whispers grew frantic, a whirlwind of voices surrounding them. "Help us! You belong to us. You are lost. Let's get out of here," Jessica yelled, pulling Sarah away from the lake. But as they turned to leave, the path they had taken vanished, replaced by an impenetrable wall of trees. "No, no, this can't be happening," Sarah screamed, her voice breaking. As they stumbled backward, a shadow materialized before them, coalescing into the form of Liam. But his eyes were vacant, devoid of recognition. "Help us! Join us!" he murmured, stepping closer, the shadows twisting around him like tendrils. "Liam, snap out of it," Mark shouted, fear gripping his heart. "You have to fight it." But Liam only reached out a hand, beckoning them closer. "You can't escape. We're all waiting for you." Jessica felt a wave of despair wash over her. "No, we won't join you," she screamed, her voice breaking the illusion. Suddenly, the shadows lunged at them, wrapping around Sarah and Mark, pulling them toward the dark figure of Liam. "Join us forever." With every ounce of strength she had left, Jessica broke free from the grip of the darkness and sprinted back toward the lake. She could hear the whispers intensifying, a chorus of pleading voices urging her to stop. "You belong to us. Don't leave." She reached the water's edge and turned to. One autumn evening, a group of 5 friends, Danny, Claire, Mason, Liz, and Jordan, decided to test their courage by exploring Black Hollow. Danny had a reputation for being the fearless one, always pushing his friends to take on the next challenge. For weeks, he had been talking about going to Black Hollow, eager to prove that the tales of the night roads were nothing more than superstition. "You guys are so scared of nothing," Danny laughed as they parked on the edge of the forest. "We're just going for a little hike. It's not like we're going to vanish into thin air." Claire, the most skeptical of the group, rolled her eyes. "I don't know, Danny. There's a reason people don't come here at night. Don't tell me you believe in ghost stories," he teased, nudging her playfully. Mason checked his watch, noting that it was just past 7 p.m. "We're sticking to the main path, right?" he asked, glancing uneasily at the darkening forest. "Of course," Danny replied with a grin, though everyone knew that if he had his way, they'd soon be exploring the unmarked trails. With flashlights in hand, they started along the narrow trail that led into Black Hollow. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The further they went, the more the air grew thick and heavy, filled with the earthy scent of damp leaves and soil. "It's quieter than I expected," Liz murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't hear any birds or animals." "Probably because they're all asleep," Jordan suggested, though he too was unnerved by the silence. As they continued, the path became narrower, and the trees closed in around them, blocking out the moonlight. They walked in single file, the only sounds being the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of a twig. Danny, leading the group, was the first to notice the strange fork in the path up ahead. "Look at this," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. The map didn't mention a fork in the trail. "Let's just go back," Claire said, anxiety creeping into her voice. "We shouldn't go any further." "Come on, it's probably just another trail," Danny said, brushing off her concerns. "We'll take a quick look and head back if it gets too weird." Reluctantly, the others followed him onto the new path. It twisted and turned erratically, unlike any trail they'd ever seen. Shadows seemed to grow darker around them, and the temperature dropped as they walked, filling them with an unnatural chill. "Something doesn't feel right," Mason said, his voice shaky. "This isn't like any trail I've been on before." "Yeah," Liz agreed, glancing over her shoulder. "It feels wrong." Suddenly, the ground beneath them shifted, and they stumbled, feeling a strange disorientation, as if they had been walking for hours instead of minutes. When they looked back, the path they had come from was gone, replaced by dense thickets of trees that seemed to stretch on forever. "Where's the trail?" Jordan asked, panic creeping into his voice. "It was just here," Danny protested, looking around wildly. As they tried to retrace their steps, they realized that the path had vanished, replaced by an endless expanse of trees. The forest around them had taken on a strange quality, as if it were somehow watching them, waiting. "Danny, this isn't funny," Claire snapped, her voice trembling. "We need to find a way out." "Calm down," Danny replied, though his own fear was starting to show. "We just need to keep moving. We'll find the road." But as they walked, the forest seemed to stretch and warp, each step taking them deeper into its heart. Their flashlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the trees that twisted and bent in unnatural ways. The air grew colder, and an unsettling silence enveloped them, broken only by the sound of their labored breathing. Then, faintly, they heard it, a whisper, barely audible but growing louder with each step. "Turn back, turn back. Did you hear that?" Liz whispered, clutching Jordan's arm. "It's just the wind," Danny insisted, though even he didn't sound convinced. The whispers grew louder, merging into an echoing chorus. "You shouldn't be here. Turn back." "Danny, we need to go back," Claire pleaded, her voice barely audible over the whispering voices. "Fine." He finally relented, his confidence wavering. "Let's try to find the main trail." They turned and walked back the way they thought they had come, but the forest was relentless, offering no familiar landmarks or signs. Hours passed, and their flashlights began to flicker as their batteries drained, leaving them with only the faintest glow to guide their way. "Guys, I don't think we're in the same place anymore," Mason said, panic in his voice. "This isn't just a trail. It's something else." "What do you mean?" Claire asked, though she already felt the same dreadful realization. "It's like the forest has us, like it's not letting us leave," he replied, his eyes wide with fear. As if to confirm his words, the forest around them seemed to shift and twist, and they found themselves standing in a different place entirely. The trees loomed taller, their branches forming an almost impenetrable canopy above, casting everything in shadow. Then, just ahead, they spotted a flickering light, barely visible through the trees. It was small, like a single candle flame, but it was their only beacon in the darkness. "We have to go toward the light," Danny said, his voice filled with a mixture of desperation and hope. "No, Danny, don't," Liz protested, pulling him back. "What if it's just another trap?" But Danny ignored her, stepping forward and leading the way toward the distant glow. The others followed, too exhausted and scared to argue, praying that the light would guide them out of the forest. As they neared the light, they realized it was coming from a small, decrepit cabin nestled between the trees. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint glow emanated from within. "Maybe someone's in there. Maybe they can help us," Jordan suggested, though his voice was laced with doubt. "Or maybe we're walking straight into a trap," Claire muttered, gripping her flashlight tightly. Danny pushed the door open, and they stepped inside, immediately hit by the stench of damp wood and rot. The room was empty, save for an old, dust-covered lantern hanging in the corner. The light flickered ominously, casting strange shadows on the walls. Suddenly, they heard a creak behind them, and the door slammed shut, plunging them into darkness. "Danny, open the door!" Claire screamed, banging against the wood. But as they struggled with the door, the whispers returned, louder than ever. "You shouldn't have come. Now you'll never leave." The voices were deafening, surrounding them from every corner of the cabin. Shadows danced across the walls, growing and shifting until they took on twisted forms, humanoid shapes with hollow eyes and outstretched hands. "Who are you?" Mason yelled, his voice trembling as he backed away. The shadows only laughed, a low, guttural sound that filled the room. "We are the ones who came before. The ones who were lost, and now you are one of us." "No, this can't be real," Liz screamed, her voice breaking as she clung to Jordan. The shadows closed in, and the friends huddled together, fear clawing at their hearts as the whispers grew louder, filling their minds with a chilling certainty. They had entered the night roads, and there was no escape. Desperate, Danny grabbed the lantern and held it up, the light illuminating the room for a brief moment. The shadows recoiled, and he seized the opportunity to kick the door open, pulling his friends outside. They bolted from the cabin, the shadows chasing them through the twisted forest. Branches scraped against their skin, and the whispers echoed around them, urging them to give in, to surrender to the darkness. Just as they were about to collapse from exhaustion, they stumbled onto a familiar path, the main trail they had started on. The shadows receded, and the whispers faded into silence. They ran without looking back, reaching the edge of Black Hollow as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. Panting and covered in dirt, they collapsed on the ground, too terrified to speak. None of them ever returned to Black Hollow after that night. They never spoke of what they saw or heard, but each of them knew that they had barely escaped the night roads. And deep down, they all knew that the forest was still waiting. One crisp October night, Alex proposed the idea to explore the woods after dark. "Come on, it's just a bunch of trees," he insisted. "What's the worst that could happen?" Emma hesitated, glancing at the towering trees in the distance. People say that the echoes are, not just normal sounds. They say it's voices, calling people into the forest. That's just a story. Luke laughed, shaking his head. Think about it. How many people actually know someone who's disappeared there? I don't know, guys, Rachel muttered. She was the most cautious of the group, and something about the idea of going into those woods at night set her nerves on edge. What if there's some truth to it? But the others teased her until she reluctantly agreed to join them. They met up at the edge of the forest around midnight, armed with flashlights, a few snacks, and a compass, just in case. The moon was full, casting a pale light over the trees and illuminating the forest path that stretched out before them like a dark, winding road. See? Nothing to be scared of, Alex said with a smirk, stepping boldly into the forest. The others followed, their footsteps crunching on fallen leaves as they ventured deeper. The woods were eerily quiet, the usual sounds of nocturnal animals strangely absent. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, watching them. So, where are these echoes supposed to be? Luke asked, keeping his tone light to mask his own growing unease. Maybe they only come out when people are alone, Alex joked, nudging him playfully. Want to wander off and find out? Ha, very funny, Luke replied, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting something to jump out at him. They walked for nearly an hour, laughing and talking to keep their spirits up. The deeper they went, however, the darker and more oppressive the forest seemed to become. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above, and their flashlights cast long, flickering shadows across the trees. Suddenly, a strange sound drifted through the air, a faint whisper, barely audible, as if someone were calling from far away. Did you guys hear that? Rachel whispered, stopping in her tracks. Hear what? Alex asked, but even he looked around nervously. Shoo, Emma said, holding up a hand. The others fell silent, straining their ears to catch the sound. And then they heard it, a soft, echoing voice drifting through the trees. It was so faint that they couldn't make out the words, but there was something unsettling about it, as though it were both near and far away at the same time. Probably just the wind, Luke muttered, though his face was pale. That didn't sound like wind, Rachel insisted, clutching her flashlight tighter. The voice came again, this time louder, clearer. It sounded like a woman's voice, calling a name, Emma's name. Emma froze, her eyes widening. Did it just say my name? Don't be ridiculous, Alex scoffed, though he too seemed rattled. It's probably just someone messing with us. The voice echoed through the trees once more, unmistakably calling out, Emma, come here. Come find me. I don't like this, Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. We need to leave. Now. But before anyone could move, another voice joined in, calling out, Alex, come closer. Come into the dark. One by one, the voices called each of their names, echoing through the trees like a haunting lullaby. Each time, the voices sounded different, as if shifting between tones and pitches, growing closer and closer. All right, this is enough, Luke said, backing up. Let's go. They turned to leave, but as they retraced their steps, the forest seemed to shift around them. The path they had come from was nowhere to be found, replaced by a dense wall of trees. Wait, this isn't right, Alex stammered, glancing around in confusion. We didn't come this way, did we? No, we didn't, Emma replied, panic rising in her voice. Where's the path? The forest seemed to close in around them, and the voices grew louder, more insistent, calling their names in a hypnotic rhythm. Luke, Rachel, Emma, Alex. They started to run, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they pushed through the undergrowth. But no matter which direction they went, the trees seemed to shift and twist, blocking their way, leading them deeper into the heart of the forest. Guys, I think we're trapped, Rachel panted, her face pale with fear. We can't be trapped, Alex argued, though his voice was filled with desperation. It's just a forest, but the trees loomed above them, silent and unmoving, as though mocking his words. The whispers grew louder, filling the air with a strange, hypnotic melody that seemed to pull them deeper into the woods. And then, suddenly, They saw it. A figure standing in the shadows, just ahead of them. It was a woman, her face obscured by darkness, but her eyes gleamed with an unnatural light. "Come closer," she whispered, her voice echoing through the trees. "You're almost here." Who are you?" Emma stammered, her voice barely audible. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she raised her hand, pointing deeper into the forest, beckoning them forward. "No way," Luke whispered, backing away. "We need to get out of here." But as he turned to run, he felt something cold wrap around his ankle, a root coiling up his leg, pulling him back. He screamed, struggling to free himself, but the root only tightened, dragging him toward the shadows. "Help me!" he cried, panic filling his voice. The others rushed to his side, pulling at the root with all their strength. But the harder they pulled, the tighter it seemed to grip him, as though the forest itself was claiming him. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the root released him, retreating back into the ground. Luke scrambled to his feet, his face pale and his body trembling. "We need to leave," Rachel said, her voice shaking. "Right now." They turned and ran, but the forest seemed to stretch on forever, an endless maze of trees and shadows. The voices continued to call their names, growing louder with each step, urging them to come closer. Then, up ahead, they saw a faint light, a break in the trees, a way out. "There," Alex shouted, pointing to the light. "That's our way out." They sprinted toward the light, their hearts pounding as the voices screamed their names, filling the air with a deafening roar. The trees seemed to reach out for them, branches clawing at their clothes, roots tangling around their feet, trying to pull them back. But they kept running, pushing through the forest with all their strength, until finally, they burst out into the open air, collapsing onto the ground just outside the tree line. For a moment, they lay there, panting and trembling, unable to believe they had made it out. When they finally looked back at the forest, they saw nothing but darkness. No voices, no figures, just an endless sea of trees. "Let's never, ever do that again," Emma gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. The others nodded, too shaken to speak. They stumbled back to town, haunted by the memory of the voices that had called their names, the whispers that had lured them deeper into the shadows. In the days that followed, they tried to forget what had happened, but the echoes stayed with them, lingering in their minds like a haunting melody. And sometimes, late at night, they would wake to the sound of their own names being whispered, faint and distant, as if the forest was still calling to them, waiting for them to return. None of them ever spoke of it again, but deep down, they knew that the echoing woods had claimed a part of them that night, a part that would always remain, lost within the shadows, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to enter.